Elysia marched toward the encampment outside the French royal palace. Battle lines were drawn between the loyalists and the revolutionaries, and anyone who dared to peek out from cover risked having their brains blown out. Despite this, there was not a trace of fear or hesitation in the young girl's eyes. Only the fire that consumes those driven by hatred could be seen. Nearly 2 years ago, at the outbreak of the war, Princess Sibylla personally killed Elysia's mother. There was no reason for this act. Sibylla, in her increasingly erratic state of mind, had become paranoid and assumed the young woman had conspired against her, though nothing could be further from the truth. This did not matter to the cruel and merciless French princess. As a result, Sibylla had thrown Elysia's mother out of a window, leaving the girl to fend for herself. Had it not been for the charity of the German church, her fate likely would have been worse than death. Elysia was accompanied by the Order of St. Berenger, or at least a small platoon of them, who swiftly made their way through the camp. The tabards they wore over their armor signaled their identity, and all the Frankish revolutionaries knelt before them. They were the militia who protected the church in these blood-stained lands. Though surprised that a young nun was leading these brave warriors of St. Berenger, they thought nothing of it. Eventually, the lieutenant of the platoon spoke with the commander of the siege camp, introducing Elysia. "This girl's name is Elysia. Her mother was a handmaiden to the witch Sibylla. She knows how to evade the defenses and gain entry into the palace. We are tasked with protecting her life so that our forces may prevail." The commander of the siege camp gazed upon the young girl with a hint of curiosity. However, he did not dare question the Order of St. Berenger. If they were acting now, it meant the German church had finally decided to intervene in this conflict. A toothy grin appeared on the man's face as he responded in the affirmative. "Very well. If that is the will of the church, who am I to complain? I'll send my best men with you. Once you have infiltrated the palace, make sure to open the gates so that our men can flood through them." The lieutenant nodded silently as he approached Elysia and asked the question that was most important to him. "Are you sure you want to do this? It's quite dangerous. You could just point the way and leave this matter to us." However, the young girl did not waver and instead shook her head, responding with a fierce tone. "No, I doubt you or your men would be able to locate the entrance, even if I told you where it was. They have concealed it well. I must do this, for the sake of my mother and all the Franks." Upon hearing this, the lieutenant sighed before nodding. In that moment, he unsheathed his bayonet and affixed it to his musket. He vowed in his heart to protect this girl from any harm as he gave the order to his men. "Protect this girl with your life. Leave the heavy lifting to the revolutionaries." The soldiers nodded and pounded their fists on their chests in a primitive salute. They waited another 30 minutes until the cover of night could conceal their advance. Elysia led them toward the edges of the walls, narrowly avoiding detection from the defenders on the ramparts above. After following the outer walls for some time, they eventually found themselves in an otherwise unnoticeable area. However, there was a small stone protruding from the wall, which Elysia quickly pressed inward. She used all the strength in her petite body to do so, and once the stone was embedded in the wall, a section of it fell down, revealing a small stone drawbridge. The soldiers reacted in shock, realizing that there were more than one stone slightly protruding. If they had not brought the girl who was intimately familiar with the secret tunnel, they would never have guessed its location, even if she told them. Elysia looked at them with a hint of impatience, being the first to enter the cavern. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Hearing this, the soldiers followed the young girl through the dark tunnel, which became increasingly clear they were going underground. No one spoke a word as Elysia pulled out a small flashlight and ignited it, allowing them to see their way into the narrow passage. Once they reached the other side, they noticed a small chain on the wall, which the lieutenant of the order quickly pulled, opening another hidden doorway. At this point, the men realized they were already within the walls of the French palace, and thus their plan to open the gates for the main force had failed. Despite this, Elysia did not appear the least bit concerned and instead motioned for the men to follow her toward a certain room. This was the quarters of Princess Sibylla, but only Elysia knew this. As the men prepared to kick down the door, they heard girlish moans from inside, indicating that whoever was behind the door was engaged in amorous activity. Ultimately, it was the young nun who broke the soldiers from their stupor. "Are you going to kick it down or what?" The soldiers looked at each other with a hint of shame before nodding their heads. Afterward, the largest man among them approached the door and violently kicked it open. The scene they witnessed was truly shocking. Unlike what they expected to find upon entering the princess's quarters, the feminine moans of pleasure were not coming from Princess Sibylla, but from King Aubrey instead. Sitting on the princess's bed was Sibylla herself. In her lap was her brother, King Aubrey, dressed in women's undergarments, riding on his sister's strapon. The sight was so shocking that none of the revolutionaries knew how to react. Immediately upon seeing the intruders, Aubrey and Sibylla screamed, but it was too late. The Order of Saint Berenger and the Frankish revolutionaries sprang into action. They leaped forward and pinned the two sinners to the ground, binding their limbs in iron shackles. Aubrey struggled desperately, but in vain. There was no hint of muscle in his entire body. How could he possibly break free from his bindings? All he could do was vent his frustrations aloud. "Unhand me, you filthy peasants! Who the hell do you think you are?" Elysia was still trying to recover from the shock of what she had just witnessed, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She could not believe that the French king and his sister were in such a relationship. Only one word entered her mind as she reflected on this: sinful. Truly, it was the most sinful thing she had ever seen. However, she could not revel in her vengeance for long, as the shouts from Aubrey and Sibylla had alerted the guards of the palace, and a great battle was about to ensue. Elysia peered through the doorway of the French princess's bedroom and into the halls. She could see shadows on the wall, moving in tandem with the voices that erupted within. The guards of House de Valois were on the move. Their intent was to safeguard the king and his sister. The revolutionaries quickly lowered the muzzles of their muskets and pulled back the hammers, preparing for the moment the enemy turned the corner. They fully intended to kill their way through the royal guards and capture Aubrey's other siblings. Once the royal family was firmly in their hands, the war would come to an end, or so they hoped. Aubrey continued to scream at the top of his lungs for help but was eventually knocked unconscious by the soldier who held him down. After several moments, a group of knights flooded the hallway, where the echo of gunfire resounded through the stone corridors. The musketeers fired their shots straight into the chests of the enemy knights, a mere meter away. Blood sprayed onto the walls as the bodies tumbled to the ground. Those who died instantly were the lucky ones, as the survivors were too wounded to move. They could only grunt in agony as they slowly bled out. After killing the initial wave of knights, the revolutionaries rapidly reloaded their muskets before charging through the hallway. However, before they fully rounded the corner, the leader of these men gave a quick command to the Order of Saint Berenger. "Quickly, escort the prisoners back to the siege camp." The militia members nodded and carried King Aubrey and his sister Sibylla out of the room, while protecting Elysia from any harm. The group quickly made their way through the tunnel and outside its confines before rushing back toward the camp. As they did so, the sound of armed conflict erupted from within the palace. The revolutionaries boldly charged forward, intent on capturing Aubrey's other siblings. After all, even if Aubrey died, there were two more men who could fill the vacancy left by the king, even if they were puppets of a dying realm. By the time Elysia and the militiamen reached the siege camp, they were exhausted. However, this did not stop the lieutenant tasked with leading the platoon from reporting the ongoing situation to the revolutionaries. "We've captured the king and the princess. However, your men went after the remaining two princes. I do not know if they still draw breath." Just as the officer spoke these words, the gate of the outer walls opened, revealing a lone revolutionary signaling the army to advance and seize the palace. "Hurry! Before the enemy catches up. Storm the keep." Without a moment's hesitation, the army of some 2,000 revolutionaries rushed out of their siege camps and toward the palace's entryway. The entire garrison was busy fighting the brave souls within the building, allowing the rebels to charge through the gates without resistance. Elysia sat back in the camp, along with the Order of Saint Berenger, who had secured King Aubrey and Princess Sibylla. She could not shake the sinful sight she had just witnessed. In fact, both the king and his sister were still naked, lying on the floor, bound and gagged. There was a murderous glint in Sibylla's eyes as she gazed at the young nun who had led the enemy through the secret passages and into the palace. Upon seeing this visceral reaction, Elysia stared into Sibylla's eyes with equal intensity before addressing the sinful woman about her misdeeds.
Princess Sibylla, it has been some time since we last met.
I'm sure you don't remember me, but I want you to know that without my help, we would have been forced to shed much more blood in the pursuit of justice. I want you to reflect on that as you march to the gallows. It was true that Sibylla did not recognize the girl or understand the reason for her grievance. However, she could not speak a single word in her defense, as she had long since been gagged and could only curse the little nun with her gaze. Not long after, the sounds of violence subsided, and the banners of the Reich flew high above the French palace. Within minutes, the Frankish revolutionaries reappeared with the king's two other siblings in tow, whom they forced to kneel in the dirt. The royal family of France had fallen into captivity, and the remaining great noble houses within the kingdom, yet to be trampled into the dirt, would soon face their maker. Elysia sighed heavily, her growing bosom heaving as the last remnants of vengeance disappeared within her fragile heart. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, her mother's killer would face justice. In the coming weeks, the Kingdom of France would stabilize as the last remnants of nobility were dragged from their homes and executed, leaving only the peasant class to forge the destiny of their people. Weeks passed after Aubrey fell into the hands of the rebels, and during this time, the Kaiser was invited to the city of Paris by the leaders of the Frankish Revolution. Berenger spared no effort and arrived in the city within the confines of his armored car. Aside from a column of armored cars and trucks housing the members of his Leibguard, Berenger was well and truly alone in this visit to the neighboring kingdom. There was only one reason the Frankish revolutionaries would ask for his presence: they wanted him to be the judge who would decide the fate of the previous monarchy. The uniforms these elite members of the Reichsguard wore were not the typical ceremonial garb they normally donned. Instead, these men were equipped in all-black uniforms, with matching Stahlhelms and greatcoats. On their left arms was a black, white, and gold armband featuring the von Kufstein coat of arms in the center. On their collars were a pair of tabs. The right side bore a white odal rune, while the left side displayed a rank insignia. If someone from Berenger's past life were to see these distinctive uniforms, they would immediately associate them with the Schutzstaffel. This was precisely what Berenger had modeled them after. As the members of his Leibguard opened the door to his armored car, Berenger gracefully stepped out, revealing his figure to the French public. The contrast between the medieval people of France and the modern attire of the Germans was truly a sight to behold as the Kaiser approached the town square, where Aubrey and his family members were bound in chains, awaiting their sentence on a central stage. As Berenger entered the scene, the members of the Frankish Revolution who had gathered to witness the execution of their former monarch raised their arms in the typical salute used by the German army and shouted at the top of their lungs, "Hail to the Kaiser!" Berenger waved to the men before approaching the leaders of the revolution, who stood by, waiting for the Kaiser's judgment. He proceeded to shake hands with each leader before announcing his judgment to the public. "Long ago, you and I shared a common heritage. Through blood and culture, we were the same. However, due to the Church's influence, the nobles of your realm have transformed into something unrecognizable to the German people. 2 years ago, during the height of your crisis, these men and women came together and declared their intention to return to their roots, to become Germans once again. At first, I laughed. The idea that the people of France could reforge the bonds that had long been severed seemed truly absurd to me. Yet, your determination has enlightened me. Today, you have all proven that you have what it takes to re-enter the German world. From this day forward, the Kingdom of France and its degenerate culture are hereby annihilated from this world forever. I announce here today that you are now Franks, and I welcome your realm into the Reich as the Kingdom of Francia. The monarch who presides over you shall be a member of my own dynasty. As for these sinners who have led you to ruin, there is only one price to be paid for the devastation they have caused: death. Bring out the guillotine." With these words, the Leibguard reached into one of the trucks they brought and carried out a guillotine, carefully placing it on the stand. The Franks gazed upon this cruel device with fascination, chanting repeatedly in the German tongue, "Death." Berenger's cruel gaze fell upon the members of the French royal family as a sadistic grin curled on his lips. Amid the vicious cheers of the crowd, he posed the question he had been waiting to ask for a very long time. "Now, who shall we start with?"
Berenger gazed into the eyes of King Aubrey and what remained of his royal family. For the hell of it, he activated the Eye of Horus, revealing the true emotions hidden behind their expressions. Aubrey was filled with terror and disbelief. There was not a single ounce of hatred in his aura, only deep regret. Sibylla's aura was as black as the abyss. Only killing intent appeared in her eyes. For the injustices she had suffered in the past and for the current situation she found herself in, she could only blame Berenger. Her hatred was so overwhelming that Berenger thought perhaps the woman would become a vengeful spirit upon her death. As for the other two siblings, they had the same aura as Aubrey. The entire royal family had been gagged, not even permitted their last words, as Berenger played a game of eeny, meeny, miny, mo with his left index finger to determine which of the four siblings he would execute first. In the end, his finger landed on the fat one. With a cruel smirk, Berenger announced the result of his little game. It appears that this little piggy is destined to die first. Remember to lift with your legs. Berenger did not even bother to remember the man's name, nor did he care to do so. The gluttonous man squealed as he was lifted off the ground by the members of the Leibguard and pushed toward the guillotine. After shoving the man's neck into the designated space, Berenger nodded slightly, sealing the man's fate. The soldiers of the Leibguard pulled the rope, and the blade fell from above, cleanly severing the man's head from his shoulders, or it tumbled into a wicker basket below. Aubrey and his siblings screamed as loudly as they could, but the rags stuffed into their mouths muffled their cries. Seeing this, Berenger merely clapped and cackled, as if he were witnessing an exciting show. The act caused no concern among the Frankish revolutionaries. After the glutton's death, Berenger pointed to his next target, the craven fool. He's next. Without hesitation, the Leibguard soldiers dragged the lanky man toward the guillotine and forced his head into the device. His eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets as he gazed at his brother's severed head. He screamed and struggled, but it was no use. The executioners pinned him down and pulled the rope, sending the uneven blade downward and decapitating the poor prince. Upon seeing two of her brothers slain in a matter of seconds, Sibylla gazed furiously at Berenger and struggled with all her might to spit out her gag. Shockingly, she managed to do so and proceeded to curse Berenger in her shrillest voice. Berenger von Kufstein. I endured the torment you put me through in your prison for an entire year. I swore from the first day I was confined that I would have my vengeance against you. It seems such a thing was not part of God's plan in this life. However, I swear to you that should we meet again in the next life, I will do everything in my power to flay the flesh from your bones. Upon hearing her wicked words, the soldiers holding Sibylla immediately punched her in the solar plexus, causing the princess to double over in vomit bile. After striking Sibylla, the Leibguard received a shocking order from their Kaiser. Wait. This woman's remarks cannot go unpunished. Cut out her vile tongue, then you may execute her with the guillotine. The soldier nearest to Sibylla unsheathed his boot knife without hesitation, pulled out her tongue, and ruthlessly cut through the organ as if it were mere butter. Blood sprayed onto the stand as the French princess choked on the sanguine liquid. Yet, her suffering did not last long, as her head was immediately stuffed into the guillotine and the blade decapitated her. Finally, all that remained of the royal family was Aubrey, who fell to his knees in agony over his sister's death. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, the feminine king of France spat the gag out of his mouth and pleaded for mercy. My Kaiser, please spare this foolish boy's life. I promise to serve you in any way you desire. Whether it is as your footstool, or as your personal plaything, so long as you let me live, I will do anything you desire. The crowd reviled in disgust at these shameful words and immediately threw refuse at the stand. Shockingly, the Kaiser raised his hand and signaled the crowd to cease their hostilities. He approached the feminine king of France and grabbed the boy's dainty chin. A smile formed on Aubrey's face as he thought that perhaps his life would be spared. However, in the next moment, as Berenger whispered into his ear, his heart sank into a bottomless abyss. In an alternate life, if I were gay and you were not such a filthy slut, perhaps I could have fallen for your feminine charms. However, from the moment I first laid eyes on you, all I have ever felt towards you is pure disgust. This world is better off without your degeneracy. Now, go to your death with the dignity of a man, though you don't even know what such a thing is.
After saying that, Berenger punched Aubrey in the face as hard as he could, breaking the boy's nose.
He then gave the order to execute the fallen king. Off with his head. The crowd erupted into cheers as Aubrey was dragged towards the guillotine.
It was clear from their shouts that the Frankish people despised their king and his sinful dynasty. In his final moments, all that remained in the feminine king's mind was an overwhelming sense of regret. The last thing Aubrey saw before the blade fell were the 3 severed heads of his siblings. Tears fell from his eyes as he was decapitated by the guillotine. Thus, the de Valois dynasty and the Kingdom of France came to an end. The cheers of the crowd continued for some time, before Berenger lifted his hand to silence them once more. With the death of Aubrey and his siblings, as well as the nobles who once ruled the realm, a power vacuum was immediately created. However, Berenger would not allow this to continue for a moment longer, and he made another announcement concerning the fate of the Franks. With the death of King Aubrey and his dynasty of sinners,
I hereby announce the annexation of the Kingdom of Francia.
I shall place my son, Prince Franz von Kufstein, as the King of Francia, and I shall rule as regent until he comes of age. In the coming days, your laws, customs, language, and culture shall be aligned with those of the Reich. With your annexation comes a solemn promise: from this day forward, not a single Frank shall go hungry. Cheers erupted across the city of Paris, spreading as swiftly as the wind. Now that the nobility has been purged and the previous dynasty eliminated, Germany will use its food surplus and the migration of its existing populace to re-Germanize the French until they become another Germanic ethnic group. On this day, the Kingdom of France and its unique culture truly fell into the annals of history. After the defeat of France and the annexation of its lands, Berenger returned home to find Honoria fully prepared for her journey east. There was a hint of unease on her face, as she realized this might be the last time she set sail toward unknown destinations in pursuit of fortune and glory. Berenger wrapped his arms around Honoria's waist and whispered words of encouragement in her ear.
You're going to do fine. Once this is over, there's a new life ahead of you. You'd be surprised how much you'll enjoy spending time with your kids. A bitter smile appeared on Honoria's lips. Her youthful days would be behind her once she returned from this journey. Now in her late 20s, she knew she couldn't keep her carefree lifestyle forever. She had responsibilities to fulfill, ones she had run from for too long. However, what happened next shocked her. A servant rushed down the palace stairs with an extra set of luggage, handed them to the Kaiser, and bowed deeply. As per your orders, I've packed your luggage, Your Majesty. Confusion flickered in Honoria's mint green eyes as she glanced at Berenger with a wry expression. You're coming with me? With a slight nod, Berenger confirmed her suspicions, then clarified, just until Singapore. I have business with the Majapahit Empire and will return to the Reich afterward. It will be up to you to reach your destination from there. Honoria was surprised to hear this, as her husband had not communicated his plans to her in advance. She did not know what was so important in Southeast Asia that the Kaiser needed to attend to it personally, but she chose not to say a word and merely bit her lower lip as she nodded in agreement. At that moment, Honoria's children appeared in the hallway. Alexandros and his sister Helena were there, with the young girl holding the infant Constantinus in her arms, a worried expression on her face. She had seen her mother go on many perilous journeys during her short life, and every time Honoria left, she could not help but feel anxious deep down. Mother, are you leaving again? Honoria's smile faded as she heard the concern in her young daughter's voice. In the next moment, she knelt down and hugged the girl before answering, I promise. This will be the last time I leave you three behind. After saying this, Honoria kissed the infant boy's forehead, then did the same for Helena. As for Alexandros, he was pouting, his arms crossed stubbornly. His mother had seldom been in his life, leaving his upbringing to Linda. Even after years of effort, he found it difficult to fully forgive Honoria for her selfishness. After kissing Helena on the forehead, Honoria approached her eldest son, wrapping her arms around him and pulling the boy into her embrace. Alex, my son, I know I haven't been the best mother, but upon my return, I promise to shower you and your siblings with all the love and affection you deserve. The young boy remained silent as his mother said farewell and approached her husband. Berenger gazed upon his children and activated the Eye of Horus. In doing so, he was able to see not only their affection for him, which was through the roof, but their feelings toward their mother. Upon seeing Alexandros' aura, Berenger could only frown. Judging by the color of his aura, there seemed to be some deep-seated resentment toward Anuria within the boy's heart. However, dispelling such negative emotions was easier said than done, and Berenger would leave that task to Anuria herself, for only she could make up for her past mistakes. After seeing that the woman was ready to depart, Berenger sighed once more before addressing his 3 children. "I will be joining your mother for the first half of her journey. While I'm away, listen to what Linda has to say and behave yourselves. Upon my return, I will take you both out for a special meal, just the 3 of us. There are some matters I need to discuss with you." Clearly, Berenger was leaving Constantinus out of this family meal, as the boy was too young to be taken to a restaurant. Alexandros and Helena responded with a silent nod, not willing to speak any further. Seeing that they were agreeable, Berenger smiled faintly before departing from the palace. He and Anuria entered a car which took them to the nearest rail station, where the royal train was waiting for them. After nearly 3.5 hours, they arrived at their destination, the city of Trieste, where Anuria's corvette awaited her. The crew of privateers were dressed and equipped for combat, with the majority wielding MP-27 submachine guns. When Berenger gazed upon them, he could only recognize 2 women. One was the vice-captain, Melissa, who had been instrumental in Anuria's escape from her homeland all those years ago, and the other was the explosives expert, Elfrun. However, Berenger almost didn't recognize the woman, as she had matured into an astounding beauty. Elfrun held a bottle of rum in one hand and wrapped her other arm around a teenage girl's shoulder, who appeared to be a recent recruit. Her firm yet dainty hands were squeezing the girl's breast, clearly marking her territory in front of the Kaiser. Upon seeing Anuria enter, Melissa and Elfrun stopped what they were doing and greeted their captain. They knew this was her last journey with them and had decided to make the trip a memorable occasion. Elfrun quickly approached Anuria, wrapped her arms around the woman's neck, and hugged her tightly. Whispering in her ear, she spoke the words she had wanted to say since learning of this retirement voyage. "I'm going to miss you, Captain. If not for you, I would have taken my life long ago." Anuria returned Elfrun's hug and embraced the woman for some time before letting go. A bitter smile on her face, she responded to Elfrun's affections. "I know. But I have responsibilities to fulfill, and I have run from them for long enough. This will be my last voyage, and after that, you can all elect your next captain. The ship is a gift to you all, so let's enjoy ourselves this one last time." Elfrun glared at Berenger upon hearing this. It was clear that he was the primary reason Anuria was hanging up piracy. She had never liked Berenger, most likely because he was Anuria's most beloved person, and she was envious of him for that. However, she did not dare act disrespectful in front of the man and quickly bowed her head before speaking. "My Kaiser, may I ask if you will grace us with the honor of sharing this voyage with your esteemed presence?" Berenger chuckled when he heard this. After briefly activating his Eye of Horus, he could see just how bitter Elfrun felt toward him. However, he really didn't need a divine artifact to know this. The woman wore her emotions on her sleeve, it was clear as day that she despised him. So, he responded to her question in a casual manner. "You can relax, Elfrun. I will only be sharing your journey for the first half. Once I'm in Singapore, I will depart so you can enjoy your expedition in peace." Elfrun felt slightly better about the whole ordeal as she took another swig from her bottle of rum before giving orders to the crew of young women, all seeking adventure and fortune. "Well, what are we waiting for? Time to set sail." With that, the ship was boarded and quickly departed from the harbor in Trieste. Anuria stood at the bow and gazed upon the city with a solemn gaze. Over the years, she had set sail from Trieste time and again. However, she knew this was likely to be the last time she gazed upon such a scene, and so she engraved it into her memory. Itami sat in her great hall and sighed to herself as she gazed upon the one man she least wanted to see. From the beginning of the Cold War between the German and Japanese empires until this moment, there had only ever been one means of contact between the two realms. Tillich Schaffhausen, the lawyer Berenger had selected to troll Empress Itami Ryo in the past, continued to be an insult to her. Her bosom heaved heavily as she struggled to calm herself after seeing this man enter her palace once more.
A hint of a smirk played on Tillich's face as he bowed respectfully before the Japanese Empress. Despite this act of decorum, Itami knew it was done in a mocking manner, and she hissed through her teeth as she asked what reason he had to visit her again. "Pray tell, to what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Schaffhausen?" "I have already done as your Kaiser requested and ceased the manufacture and sale of the so-called Mk2 Schmidt guns." "So, what possible reason could you have to pester me once more?" The tone in Itami's voice made it clear that she was greatly displeased by his presence. So much so that Tillich felt the task he had been given was unnecessary. Simply by entering her home, he had caused Itami to become distressed. However, the second Kaiserin Linda von Kufstein had specifically ordered him to present the Japanese Empress with a gift, an item he did not know and dared not peek at. After hearing Itami's words of displeasure, the man could only bow once more before explaining the reason for his visit. The von Kufstein family has decided to impart a gift to the magnificent Japanese Empress. It is their hope that you will enjoy this present to your heart's content. After saying this, the man whistled, and two German men approached with a wooden crate, causing Itami and her guards to observe it with caution. Itami did not know what kind of prank Berenger was playing on her, but she would not easily fall for it. With a sharp tongue, she issued an order to her royal guardsmen. "Open it, but do so with caution." After saying this, she glared at the German lawyer and threatened him in a severe tone. "I don't know what kind of games you, or your emperor, are playing, but make no mistake. If your precious gift offends me in any way, I will have your head." Tillich gulped heavily at these words. From the expression on Itami's face, he knew she was not making an empty threat. He was seriously concerned about just what kind of gift Linda had prepared for Itami. Clearly, it was something meant to antagonize the woman. The Japanese guards pried the crate open with a crowbar and pointed their weapons towards it, fearing it might be some kind of threat. However, when they peered inside, they found only a framed painting. After pulling it out, they displayed it to their empress as they kneeled before her. The look on Itami's face caught Tillich by surprise. She seemed stunned into silence. The painting was a portrait of Berenger in his imperial regalia, entirely photorealistic, and done by the first princess of the Reich, who had signed her name in the bottom right corner. Itami slowly rose from her seat and approached the painting without realizing it. Her actions caught everyone who witnessed them by surprise. It was as if she was in a trance. She had to admit that she never imagined Berenger would be so handsome. Then again, she tried her best to deny this reality as she slowly regained control of her thoughts. After doing so, she glared at the Tillich and questioned him about the painting. "This is your Kaiser? And why would he send me a portrait of himself?" The German lawyer scratched the back of his head before responding to the woman's question. He didn't even know what the present was prior to this moment, let alone why Linda had sent it to Itami. Initially, he thought it was meant to antagonize her, but there was nothing antagonistic about the extravagant portrait. Thus, he could only answer honestly. A minor correction: while this is a painting of His Majesty, Kaiser Berenger von Kufstein, this portrait was sent by Her Majesty, Kaiserin Linda von Kufstein. I don't know the exact reason she sent it, and a lowly servant like myself could never speak on her behalf. However, this is my only reason for making such a long journey, so if that is all, then I will be departing. Itami was lost in her thoughts as she gazed upon the image. She had completely failed to notice the lawyer's departure while trying her best to find some hidden meaning behind this gift. Though she had no way of knowing it, Linda was a master of manipulation, and the red-headed beauty knew how to get into a woman's head better than anyone. By presenting a portrait of Berenger at his most handsome, Linda was gambling on the notion that the Japanese Empress, known worldwide for her unreasonably high standards, would subconsciously find Berenger more desirable, thereby weakening her resolve to fight the Reich in a life-or-death struggle. Itami had no way of knowing Linda's intention, nor that it had actually succeeded. Though she had never met Berenger, Itami had been bested by him at every turn. Combined with Momo's insistent nudging by calling the man brother-in-law, and personally witnessing Berenger's exceptional appearance, Itami's heart was affected in ways she had yet to realize. It took Itami several moments of silence before she realized that Tillich had departed. Upon seeing she was alone with her guards, Itami sighed heavily before revealing her thoughts about the gift. "Hang this painting in my quarters. At the very least,
it is a decent piece of art. The royal guards did not hesitate to follow Itami's instructions and quickly took the gift to her bedroom. As for Itami herself, only she knew the complex emotions she felt after witnessing her greatest rival's appearance. Itami had to admit that she had underestimated the Reich. Initially, she thought they had focused solely on the path of war. However, after seeing such a magnificent work of art, she realized that Berenger had not only advanced Germany's industry but also its culture in ways she could not fully grasp. A deep sense of jealousy stained Itami's heart as she began to realize just how far behind she was from the empire her rival had created. Staring silently at her throne, she posed a question to herself. If I were to have ruled for the same amount of time as Berenger, would I have accomplished the same feats? Despite dwelling on this question for some time, Itami knew the answer deep within her heart. This realization elicited a sigh from the beautiful young woman as she slowly walked back to her throne and sat down. She sat there for a while, lost in thought, until the sun began to set. Eventually, she returned to her room, where the portrait hung across from her bed. Holding a bottle of sake in one hand, she continued to observe it in silence. The young Japanese empress reached out and touched the painted cheek of the German Kaiser, then spoke aloud, almost mindlessly. "So handsome." However, after saying this, Itami looked back toward her bed, where her Julian body pillow lay, a tinge of guilt in her blood-red eyes. This caused her to drop her bottle of sake and run toward the pillow, pulling it into her bosom as if speaking to Julian himself. "Julian, it's not like that. It's just a fantastic piece of art, that's all. I don't have any feelings toward that smug bastard at all." Utter silence filled the room as Itami's gaze shifted between the body pillow that represented her deceased love interest and the extravagant portrait of the German monarch. Finally, she fell asleep. Berenger stood on board the Honoria-class corvette, which had replaced the previous iteration of the ship known as Queen Honoria's Revenge. This corvette was essentially a scaled-down Ritter von Bettinger-class destroyer. The ship had a crew of 65 and was equipped with a limited armament of one 127mm automatic gun, two 20mm point defense systems, and 4 torpedo tubes. At the moment, anti-ship missiles were still under development, but once the technology was perfected, Honoria's crew would be able to modify their vessel to accept such weapons. 3 Adela-class destroyers acted as escorts for the smaller ship. These destroyers each housed a detachment of Marines who would be accompanying Honoria and her girls on their journey to Australia. Berenger gazed upon the Mediterranean Sea as the sun descended, a glass of his finest 12-year-old whiskey in his left hand. He sipped the amber liquid slowly, savoring the intense flavor. While the Kaiser was drinking alone, his third wife, Honoria, approached him. They were both dressed in naval uniforms, with Honoria adopting the appearance of a sailor and Berenger that of an admiral. Although Berenger had noticed her approach, he silently stared out to sea while she wrapped her arms around him from behind. A faint smile played on her perfectly sculpted face as she whispered just loudly enough for the two of them to hear, "It's hard to believe this is the last time we will sail off into the sunset together." In response, Berenger merely scoffed, turned around, and placed his hand on Honoria's cheek. There was a look of hope in his eyes as he spoke the words his wife wanted to hear most. "On the contrary, I believe many voyages await us in the future. However, rather than being militant in nature, they will be pleasure cruises for our entire family to enjoy. Perhaps after the war with Japan ends, and the oceans are safe for us to travel, I will commission a grand yacht for our family to sail across the world, and see all it has to offer." Honoria rested her head on Berenger's chest. She gazed up into his deep blue eyes with a more noticeable smile on her pretty face, and uttered the words she felt deep within her heart. "That sounds nice." Unfortunately for the couple, their romantic moment was interrupted by the giggles of 3 women who rushed onto the deck in their underwear. From what Berenger could tell, Elfrun was playfully chasing after a few of the new recruits with a bottle of rum in one hand and a toy in the other. The veteran pirate called out to these young women, wrapped her arms around one of them, and placed the toy in the girl's delicate mouth. "Come on, girls. It's time for your initiation." As if Elfrun had forgotten the Kaiser was on board, she pushed the recruit down onto the ground and began to play with her body. Berenger merely sipped his whiskey as he enjoyed the show.
However, Honoria was in the middle of facepalming as she sighed in disappointment before alerting the trio of women to her presence.
Elfron, did you forget we have a guest on board? It's fine if you want to play with the girls in your own room, but doing so in the middle of the deck is inappropriate, don't you think?
A shameless smile appeared on Elfron's lips as she finished kissing the recruit's exposed breasts before nodding her head in agreement with her captain's words.
I suppose you're right, girls. Let's head back to my quarters, and I'll show you the true meaning of sisterhood.
The two recruits blushed in embarrassment as they heard these words, but they did not resist in the slightest. It was only after the three women had left that Berenger sighed and shook his head. She seems to be enjoying herself. Honoria snatched the glass of whiskey from his hand and quickly downed its contents before responding to the man's statement.
A little too much, if you ask me.
However, most of these girls joined the crew to get away from their civil responsibilities.
It's not really a surprise that half of them experiment with one another.
A slight chuckle erupted from Berenger's lips as he wrapped his arm around Honoria's shoulder and pulled her close.
The next question he asked sent shivers down the woman's spine. What about you? Have you ever experimented with your crew? A single glance into Berenger's cold gaze told Honoria that this question was more than just mere curiosity.
She had to calm her nerves before answering with the honest truth.
No.
Elfron has wanted to get into my pants, but I've never played with any of my crew.
As a member of your royal harem, I felt it was inappropriate to lower myself to such common behavior.
The only women I have ever been with are your other girls.
Utter silence followed as Honoria waited for her man's reply.
In the end, a single word escaped his lips as he nodded his head in approval.
Good.
Not long after, Melissa entered the scene, shaking her head in disapproval.
She couldn't help but comment on Elfron's lustful behavior.
Good God, that woman sure knows how to take advantage of the new girls. I think she's just coping with the fact that this is probably the last time she will ever see you. Melissa brought a bottle of rum and a pair of glasses, which she filled for herself, Honoria, and Berenger's empty cup. The trio clinked their drinks together as the former prostitute gave a toast to her captain.
To a new tomorrow.
I truly hope you can be happy after putting the life of a privateer behind you. A bitter smile appeared on Honoria's lips as she heard this, but she refused to say anything and instead took a sip of the black spiced rum. Her eyes drifted to the sea as she contemplated what the future held. After several moments of silence, she finally commented on her situation. I'm sure you'll make a great captain, Melissa. After all, you've led these girls on more adventures than I have. However, in a shocking response, Melissa shook her head and sighed heavily. A defeated expression appeared in her eyes as she reflected on the whole ordeal.
This is my last voyage as well. I've made a vast fortune during the time I've spent pirating with you girls. If I'm being completely honest, I don't even recognize half the faces on board this ship anymore. Most of the girls I've seen as sisters have either perished in conflict or retired in peace. I can rest easy knowing Elfron intends to continue what you started. Perhaps I'll settle in New Haven. I hear the city is a den of vice, and that sounds like my kind of place. I might use the wealth I've gained to open a brothel and treat the girls better than I was treated during my years in such a profession. I'm not going to lie. The only reason I stayed on this long as a member of this crew was to make sure you were safe. Once you retire, I will go with you. Besides, there's something else that deeply concerns me. Be honest with me, this upcoming war with Japan is going to be more dangerous than anything we have come across before, isn't it? Honoria didn't answer Melissa's question.
Instead, Berenger replied with a solemn tone in his voice.
More than you can possibly imagine.
For the first time since I granted you girls a letter of marque and reprisal, you will be facing an adversary whose vessels are at the very least on a near-peer level. If this ship is unfortunate enough to be intercepted by a Japanese fleet, it is game over for all of you. If I'm being perfectly honest, this is the primary reason I am forcing Honoria to step down.
Melissa simply nodded and sighed before responding to the Kaiser's claim. I understand.
While I know I can't force Elfron to retire, at the very least, I can alert her to the danger she will be facing.
Thank you for being honest with me. The two of you enjoy the rest of the evening. I'm going to make sure the crew is aware of their responsibilities over the upcoming days."
After saying this, Melissa abruptly departed, leaving Berenger and Anuria alone on the deck. They gazed upon the setting sun with troubled looks in their eyes.
Only time would tell how much devastation would result from the war between Germany and Japan.
However, one thing was certain to Berenger: the end result would be a new world, where Germany reigned unchallenged for generations to come. Emperor Asha gazed upon a group of prisoners with a pitiful glint in his eye. He could hardly believe that matters had come to this, but without punishing these men, he would never be able to retain his Japanese backers. Months had passed since the Bengal Emperor first began his campaign to unify the Indian subcontinent under his banner. During this time, his troops, under the threat of death, behaved themselves quite well. However, as the war continued and these men were forced to march endless miles in pursuit of a goal they did not fully believe in, it was inevitable that some would break the rules of war imposed upon them by a foreign empress, one whose favor their own monarch desperately sought to win. Nearly 250 soldiers of the Bengal army were bound and gagged, kneeling on the ground in front of a ransacked village. These men had committed mass rape and murder in the territory where they now knelt, killing every man and boy and forcing themselves upon every woman and girl, regardless of age.
In the past, such actions might have been overlooked as a natural consequence of war.
However, Empress Itami had already punished the Bengal army by withdrawing support in a critical aspect. As an act of reprisal for their previous abhorrent behavior, Itami Ryo had halted the sale of Gatling guns to their Bengal proxies. In reality, this was done to avoid invoking the ire of the Reich, who claimed to have patented the device years before her own invention. However, Itami did not explain this to Emperor Asha, instead stating that her actions were punishment for his previous crimes. This prompted Asha to take immediate action upon realizing that his soldiers were not following the rules of war insisted upon by the Japanese, fearing that Empress Itami might cut military support in other areas. As a result, Asha did not look the least bit fierce as he sighed heavily before condemning 250 of his own soldiers to death. In fact, one might say he was overwhelmed with fatigue. "You were all made aware some time ago about the rules and regulations you were to abide by during this conflict. Yet, here we stand. A devastated village, brought to ruin by your own lust and greed. Such crimes cannot be tolerated, and thus I can only sentence you all with the harshest of punishments, death. Soldiers of Bengal, let this be a lesson to you all about the consequences of your actions. Do it." After saying this, the man looked the other way. Ironically, he was not able to face the consequences of his own actions. Despite the hesitancy on the part of their emperor, the most loyal soldiers of the Bengal army chambered a round into their lever-action rifles before pulling the trigger. A loud crackle of gunfire filled the air as the 250 war criminals were sent to the afterlife. Though Asha wanted this to be an example to his army, he would be remiss to find out that it would ultimately have the opposite effect. Upon seeing their own brothers in arms gunned down for committing acts which they had all previously engaged in, the Bengal soldiers would soon find themselves embittered toward their emperor and his Japanese masters. Despite these treacherous thoughts, the war continued, and soon enough the Kakatiya dynasty would fall to the Bengal tide, allowing Asha to advance on the most powerful of the Indian states outside of the Anangpur Empire, the Pandya dynasty. While the Bengal army waged war in India, Itami had dispatched her own forces to the islands that were once known as the Philippines in her past life. Unlike in Itami's past life, the religion of Islam never spread to Asia, and as a result, the Philippines was divided between Hindu states in the south and Chinese states in the north. Under the command of the recently appointed General Saito Koronari, the Imperial Japanese Army landed on the island chain with little resistance. In fact, the local petty kingdoms were entirely unaware of the invasion until it was too late. For months, Japan had been flexing its growing naval power by protecting cargo ships traveling to the Philippines. Consequently, the local realms did not suspect a full-scale invasion of their homelands as a possibility, even when a large number of Japanese ships gathered off their coasts. The Japanese Empire faced a crisis as it learned more about the capabilities of its rival in the Western world. Empress Itami Ryo knew that if her armies were to stand a chance against the Reich, they needed to mechanize quickly. However, to do this, she needed oil, a resource that her empire currently lacked. Fortunately, the island of Mindanao, the second largest in the archipelago, was home to the Liguasan Marsh, which contained a significant reserve of oil and natural gas. Mindanao was also home to several petty kingdoms that Itami had previously attempted to bribe into accepting annexation. However, after news of her soldiers' war crimes in other occupied regions spread, this option was no longer viable, and the Japanese resorted to a full-scale invasion. Under the cover of night, the Imperial Japanese Army disembarked from the vessels that carried them and landed on the shores of Mindanao.
No one was aware that an entire brigade of Japanese soldiers had landed on the island.
Securing the beachhead, the Japanese army ferried their cavalry and logistic caravans. Much like the Ming army, Itami had equipped her forces with Tachanka-like vehicles, in the hopes of providing mobile firepower to her infantry, who were entirely lacking in armored vehicles. Within an hour, 5,000 Japanese soldiers had landed on the shores of Maguindanao, where they swiftly conquered the nearest village to their landing spot. For the families who rested in their homes on this silent night, it came as a sudden surprise when the Japanese soldiers kicked down their doors and mercilessly gunned down those who resisted their sudden occupation. It took less than 30 minutes for the soldiers to seize control of the village. After the area was secure, General Itami stepped into the captured town and planted the Japanese flag on its soil. The general spoke in his native tongue, announcing to the locals with an intimidating shout, "As of this moment, the Rajanate of Maguindanao is hereby annexed into the Japanese Empire.
All hail your new Empress! All hail the rising sun!"
Naturally, the native inhabitants of the island did not understand a word he said, but the moment the general pulled out his sidearm and fired it into the air, "General," the village folk knelt on the floor in fear for their lives. Unfortunately for the local population, they had no say in the matter of their annexation. Though news would rapidly spread throughout the island of the Japanese occupation, there was simply nothing that the primitive Filipino states could do to prevent the Japanese takeover of their homeland.
Any resistance against the advanced Japanese army was met with swift retaliation.
In the face of overwhelming firepower, it would only take a matter of weeks before the Japanese army had occupied the entire Rajanate of Maguindanao.
Thus, while Brangar was sailing to Singapore for a diplomatic visit to the Majapahit Empire,
Itami made the first move toward taking the Philippines for herself, an action that would ultimately draw the ire of the Ming dynasty.
The journey to the German naval base in Singapore was a lengthy one.
Since the ship was only a corvette, its range was vastly inferior to some of the larger warships in the Kriegsmarine. Consequently, the vessel had to stop within the Anangpur Empire to refuel before making its way to the Malacca Strait. Upon arriving at his destination, Berengar said a brief farewell to his wife, Honoria, before departing the vessel and entering the military base in Singapore. The moment he stepped onto the docks, he found that the admiral tasked with overseeing the daily operations of the naval base was there to greet him. A wide grin formed on Berengar's face as he approached the man who had saluted him. "Admiral Noel Schreiber, it is a pleasure to see you again.
I trust you have been well over these past few years?"
The admiral had a tan complexion and was dressed in a short-sleeved navy blue cotton uniform designed for the tropics. He wore a pair of sunglasses and an officer's cap on his head. It was clear that the environment had affected his appearance, as he lacked the fine porcelain skin common among those who dwelled in the Alps. Despite this, the man smiled and nodded his head before responding to his Kaiser's question.
"Of course, my Kaiser. I must say, I very much enjoy the environment here.
However, I doubt you came all this way to speak to me about such simple matters.
So tell me, how can I assist you?"
Berengar gazed across the Malacca Strait for several moments in silence. It was clear that his attention was elsewhere, though only he truly knew his exact thoughts. After several moments, he gave the admiral an order, one he could not refuse.
"You are correct in your assumption.
I came all this way for a diplomatic visit to the Majapahit Empire.
I need a ferry and an escort.
Prepare your fastest craft and a squad of your finest kampfschwimmers.
I want to depart within the hour."
Admiral Schreiber had heard rumors that the Kaiser had taken the Majapahit princess as a concubine, but he never dared to believe them until now. Berengar's appearance made it clear that he was a bit anxious about this meeting, something the man would not normally express if it were a mere diplomatic visit to a primitive realm. However, Nolv did not speak of these matters, knowing better than to pry into the Kaiser's private life. Instead, he nodded his head and accepted his orders.
"As you command, my Kaiser." I will prepare your team to depart within the hour, as you have requested. After saying this, Admiral Schreiber sent off a runner to get these things in order, while he showed Berenger around the naval/airbase that had been established in Singapore. The area, being the closest to the zone of conflict that was sure to occur in the future, had seen significant investment from the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe in terms of time, resources, and manpower. Well over 1,000 aircraft were stationed at the airbase, along with their crew, making it the largest airbase in the world. This did not include the aircraft stationed aboard the carrier. As for the vessels in the area, the 6th Fleet was based in Singapore, while various destroyers, corvettes, U-boats, and fast attack craft protected the Malacca Strait. There were also special operations units attached to the naval base, known as Kommando Spezialkraft Marine, KSM for short, not the infamous Jagged Commandos. They were also called Kampfschwimmers. This Naval Special Forces unit was modeled after the U.S. Navy SEALs from Berenger's past life and was primarily active in Asia, which is why a large number of them were concentrated at the Singapore Naval Base. Those who became Kampfschwimmers were recruited from the ranks of the Naval Infantry, also known as the Marines. They then went through a 3-year pipeline to become Special Warfare Operators. The intense training had a 99% attrition rate, meaning 1 in 100 men would succeed in becoming Kampfschwimmers. As promised, within the hour, the ship was prepared, along with the escort of Kampfschwimmers, who all saluted their Kaiser as they gazed upon him. These special warfare operators were not dressed in the usual uniforms that the soldiers of the Reich wore. Instead, they were dressed in what could be described as a Gorka mountain suit dyed in the Blumentarn camouflaged pattern. Over this, they wore plate carriers in the style of the classic Defender II, which were Feldgrau in color. The load-bearing equipment they utilized was loosely modeled after the Sposen Smersh and matched the plate carrier in color. On their heads were Feldgrau M56/76 Stahlhelms, with Feldgrau netting over them. Their boots and gloves were modern in design and Feldgrau in color. The weapons these special operators carried were not the usual STG-27s, which saw standard service among the German military. Instead, they were a copy of the infamous STG-44 from the Second World War of Berenger's past life. This was the new equipment issued to the special operations units within the Reich's military, such as the Jaegers, Jagged Commandos, and the Kampfschwimmers. Berenger gazed upon their advanced equipment and nodded in approval before giving the order to move out. Time waits for no man. Let's depart. After saying this, the operators boarded the fast attack craft, which would carry Berenger across the Malacca Strait and into the heart of the Majapahit Empire, where the king and princess were awaiting his visit. Some time passed as Berenger enjoyed the journey before arriving at the Majapahit port city, where a convoy was already prepared for the Kaiser's arrival. After disembarking, Berenger, along with his escort, quickly entered the vehicles provided for him and slowly but surely made their way to the Majapahit palace. The moment Berenger stepped out of the carriage and into the courtyard, he saw Princess Angreni rush out to meet him. She had a small child, no older than 2, in her arms. It was clear by the boy's features that he was half European. This was Berenger's child, and the sight of his son brought a fervent smile to his face. Berenger hugged the Majapahit princess as they reunited, then kissed his son on the forehead. Afterward, he quickly inquired about the boy's name. "I presume this is my son. What have you named him?" Angreni gazed at Berenger's handsome face for a moment. The last time they met, he still wore an eye patch. Now, he had a pair of mismatched irises, a sight that caused her heart to flutter. It took the woman a few seconds to compose herself before announcing her son's name to his father. "His name is Dharma, and yes, he is your son. Is that all you have to say to me? You don't know how much I missed you." Berenger nodded in approval when he heard this. At least it was a name he could pronounce, unlike whatever Tlexikli had named their son. Berenger could tell the half-German, half-Indonesian child would grow up to be a handsome man, and he felt nothing but pride when gazing upon such a young son. Part of the reason he had come to the Majapahit Empire was to see the son he had never met, and now that he saw the boy, he was satisfied. After reuniting with his concubine and their child, Berenger felt at ease, which allowed him to take charge of the situation. He led the mother and child into her home. Yes, I missed you, too. However, I have not come all this way just to see my child. There are important matters to discuss, so let us go meet your father. I have many words I wish to speak to him.
Angrani did not refuse, even though she was a bit aggrieved by how little emphasis Berenger seemed to put on their reunion. She quickly followed her man into the palace where her father was resting. The Majapahit princess had no idea what Berenger wanted to say, but she could make an educated guess. It most likely revolved around the threat of the Japanese Empire, and this worried her about what her father might say. Berenger stood within the great hall of the Majapahit palace, where a middle-aged man sat upon his golden throne. The man stared at the German Kaiser, of whom he had heard much from his errant daughter.
Upon seeing Berenger in all his glory, Suratman had to admit, he was slightly disappointed.
Berenger had arrived in his imperial regalia, with all the embellishments on full display. First impressions were important, especially to the father of the girl he was courting. He could have worn his military uniform with his sleeves rolled up and his collar unbuttoned, but he chose to display the prestige afforded him as the Kaiser of the Reich. The Majapahit king carefully observed Berenger's appearance before speaking his thoughts in Sanskrit, believing Berenger would not understand.
So this is the mighty Kaiser, whose armies are so vast they can cover all the land beneath the sun. I must say, when I first heard of such a man, I had assumed he would be more fearsome.
Berenger remained utterly silent when he heard these words. Though in his 30s, he still looked young for his age, perhaps due to good genetics or his diet. Either way, he appeared no older than his late 20s. This youthful and princely appearance meant Berenger did not immediately convey the impression of the world's most powerful man. Angrani pouted when she heard her father's words and quickly scolded him for his rude remarks. As someone who had witnessed the power of the Reich firsthand, she could not fathom anyone being so foolish as to make such a crass remark about the Kaiser's appearance. Let alone her own father. Father, you would do well to remember the German fleet that sits across the Malacca Strait. Even though you are king of these lands, it is not appropriate to be so rude to the Kaiser. I suggest you mind your words carefully when you speak to him in a language he can understand. In truth, Berenger was not the least bit offended by the man's statement. His youthful appearance was actually something he took pride in. Therefore, he raised his hand to silence his concubine before speaking in the Sanskrit tongue, an act which surprised both of them. There's no need for the man to mind his manners. He's right. My appearance is far from what most people would expect of someone with my power. I fully admit I am far from the most intimidating-looking man. Though I may not be fearsome to look at, I assure you that with a stroke of the pen, I could condemn any kingdom on this planet to oblivion.
Suratman was surprised when he heard Berenger speak Sanskrit so fluently.
He felt deeply ashamed for the words he had spoken earlier, unaware that the Kaiser could understand them. After several moments of silence, the Majapahit king raised his voice with a stern look in his eyes.
Why are you here?
Berenger smiled when he heard this, then raised two fingers as he expressed his reasons for visiting the Southeast Asian Empire with a carefree expression. I came here for two reasons. My first reason for visiting your kingdom was to see my son with my own eyes, whom I had yet to meet until this day. I must say, though I have not been with the boy for long, I already approve of him. As for the other reason for my visit, to put it simply, King Suratman, I have come to discuss the threat the Japanese Empire poses to your borders.
Are you aware that, as of this moment, the Imperial Japanese Army is waging war across the island of Mindanao?
Soon, the entire region will be embroiled in conflict, and you will lose a valuable trading partner. If the nobles beneath your banner are not yet convinced of the threat the Japanese Empire poses to your sovereignty, then I suggest they look to the east and carefully observe this conflict. Your kingdom has no chance of defending your isles against the Japanese military unless you can seize absolute control over both the nobles beneath your banner and the vassals who swear fealty to you. So, I have come with three proposals that I think you will find interesting. The Majapahit king gazed at the Kaiser with a sharp look in his eyes. He was entirely unaware that the island of Mindanao had been invaded by the Japanese, but if this was true, it was the excuse he needed to rally his vassals and assume direct control over his empire. Thus, he slowly nodded his head as he spoke.
Go on.
Berenger smiled upon hearing this simple phrase before speaking of his propositions, which he knew Suratman had no way of rejecting. First, Princess Angrani and our son Dharma will return with me to the Reich as permanent ambassadors to my empire.
This is non-negotiable.
I intend to raise my son in an environment that will allow him to thrive in the future, and as great as your kingdom is, it is a far cry from the fatherland. Second, I demand that you recognize my claim over the Australian continent. As we speak, my agents are sailing to the region to plant our flag on its soil. It would not only benefit my empire but yours as well to support this claim. Lastly, I suggest that you allow further cooperation between our armed forces. I will continue to supply your army with weapons and training so that by the time the Japanese set their sights on Borneo, your forces will be adequately prepared to repel them.
Suratman gazed upon the German emperor with intense focus.
By the tone in Berenger's voice, the man was essentially giving an order to the Majapahit king instead of making a friendly request. However, after seeing the massive steel warships across the Malacca Strait, Suratman could admit that if there was one man who could walk into his home and give him orders, it was the Kaiser.
After several moments of silence, Suratman nodded in agreement.
Now that he was aware of the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, he could use this to his advantage. With further German support, he would successfully be able to centralize his authority, something the Majapahit king greatly desired.
Very well. I will agree to these demands. However, I must say that I am greatly displeased by your tone.
Still, I admit that I need your support if I have any hope of holding off the Japanese when they finally decide to invade my lands.
If you don't mind me asking, how do you know they will attack Borneo first?
Berenger wore a smug smile as he answered this question in a rather cryptic manner. Let's just say there is a resource on that island critical for the development of Empress Itami's armed forces.
One that she won't be able to get anywhere else.
Thus, I am fairly certain that when she finally decides to attack your kingdom, she will do so by landing her troops on Borneo first.
Though Suratman did not know how Berenger knew this information, he did not immediately dismiss it as false.
Instead, he considered it earnestly for some time before nodding his head in agreement.
Very well, consider me convinced.
I look forward to working with you and your empire in the future.
Please stay.
I have arranged a feast for your arrival. You should enjoy your time here in my lands to the best of your ability. Berenger simply smiled and nodded, speaking the words that immediately came to his mind.
I thank you for your hospitality.
With this said, Berenger would enjoy the rest of his evening, drinking and feasting to his heart's content. Itami sat upon her throne with a disinterested look in her sanguine eyes. Standing across from her was someone she had never wanted to see again. However, against her wishes, the Ming Prince Zhu had returned to Japan, and it seemed his goal was to gain Itami's favor. The young man bowed respectfully before the Japanese empress as he presented gifts to the woman he longed for most in this world.
Empress Itami, your beauty is renowned across the world.
I fear any gift I might bring is inadequate for a woman of your caliber. However, it is my humble opinion that these furs and fine jades will enhance your noble bearing. The fur shawl was as white as Itami's hair and masterfully crafted. One glimpse of such a fine accessory would likely drive most women to envy. However, in Itami's eyes, it was a gift she would rather not accept. Alongside the exquisite white furs, there was a dragon pendant made from imported German white gold and the purest white jadestone. It, too, was crafted by the best artisans the Ming dynasty had to offer. Though Itami wanted nothing more than to deny these gifts and send Zhu packing, she knew better than to antagonize her largest trading partner. As a result, she sighed heavily before nodding her head in silence. A few servants stepped forward and accepted the gifts on her behalf, causing a smile to curve Zhu's lips until Itami finally spoke.
How are your brother's conquests in Indochina faring?
These words caused the Ming prince's heart to sink.
Itami had not even acknowledged the gifts, nor given them any attention.
Instead, her servants merely carried the presents off to some unknown location. As for her first question, it pertained to his elder brother, not himself. Although Zhu had been dismissed the last time he visited the Japanese empress, the woman left an impression on his heart that caused him to fall madly in love. He had forsaken all his concubines and tried to think of the best ways to win Itami's affections. However, his gifts had no impact on the woman's icy heart. Instead, she seemed more interested in his elder brother. As a result, Zhu did his best to tarnish his brother's reputation. My brother is doing his best to conquer Indochina, but his results are slow, and father often complains about his methods.
He has apparently been quite cruel in his campaign thus far.
I begged father to allow me to undertake the effort on his behalf, but unfortunately, he chose Brother Ji.
As a result, many innocents have perished in this invasion.
However, I'm sure, as the Empress of the mighty Japanese Empire, you have no concerns about such minor matters.
Itami said nothing and did not react to this news. She had not met Zhu Ji and was unaware of his personality.
Her agents were already stretched thin, and she could not obtain any reliable information about the war in Indochina. Despite this, she did not trust a word Zhu said about his elder brother. After all, the man seemed willing to lie to accomplish his goals. After careful consideration, the Japanese Empress simply nodded in silence, unwilling to waste her breath entertaining this fool's fantasies. Instead, after several moments, she responded rather cruelly to the Ming prince. "Since you have come all this way to visit, I shall show you my hospitality. There will be a feast tonight for your pleasure, but unfortunately, I have other matters that I must attend to and will not be present. Enjoy your stay, and have a safe journey back to your homeland, Prince Zhu." Zhu could not believe his ears. After all the effort he had gone through, the woman was willing to meet him only once, before sending him on his way. He was struggling to accept this outcome, even as Itami stepped off her throne and began to depart from the great hall. He could not help but call out to the aloof woman, who seemed entirely disinterested in worldly affairs.
"Empress Itami, wait. I have come all this way to see you, and yet you are not even willing to dine with me? What is so important that you must abandon your guests?"
Itami stopped dead in her tracks and turned around to glare at the man who dared to intervene in her personal affairs. Her blood-red eyes held a murderous glint as she spoke the honest truth to him. "Zhu, out of respect for your father, I have taken time out of my busy schedule to see you and accept your gifts. Though I have accepted these items you have presented, it does not mean that I have responded positively to your affections. In fact, I find your attempts to woo me quite laughable, especially after the mess you caused the last time you visited my domain. Allow me to make this clear to you so you can abandon your wild fantasies and move on with your life, free from the chains that bind you. I shall not belong to any man who has not bested me at my own game. You are no warrior, nor are you a great scholar, or a talented artist. You are a pitiful prince with no extraordinary talents to speak of. Your greatest asset is the fact that you are your father's son and somewhat good-looking. Unfortunately for you, there is a man in this world whose appearance makes you look mediocre by comparison. To put it simply, you are entirely incapable of winning my affections. You are not even qualified to make an attempt. So go home before you make a further fool of yourself." After hearing all of this, Zhu was enraged beyond measure. He had grown up with an exceptional background and appearance. Because of this, women from around the Eastern world were willing to throw themselves at him. Never before had he been rejected, let alone so ruthlessly. Who did Itami think she was? He could forgive some of what she said, as it was accurate, and even he could not deny such statements with a straight face. However, he could not forgive her insulting his appearance, which caused him to lash out at the Japanese Empress, who had kindly hosted him in her home despite his ill intentions. "You say there is a man who makes me look mediocre by comparison? Who is this bastard? I'll maim him in such a way that no woman will ever dare to gaze upon his mangled flesh. So much so that you will forget the words you have spoken to me today." Despite his threats, Itami merely wore a pitiful smirk on her perfect face as she dashed the man's dreams with a single name.
"Berenger von Kufstein. Tell me, Zhu, do you dare say the same words now that you have heard his name?"
Berenger von Kufstein was a name that the entire royal family of the Ming dynasty was keenly aware of, mostly because it was the crown prince who spoke so highly of the man. However, no matter what praises Zhu's mouth uttered, the man had never said a word about Berenger's appearance, even when cornered by his sisters about the topic. Naturally, Zhu had researched Berenger's background, and the words spoken about the man were almost fantastical. It made it hard for him to believe even a tenth of the man's history was accurate. However, there was one undeniable fact: Berenger von Kufstein had brought the entire Western world under his heel in a mere 10 years. This alone was enough to make the Ming prince understand that the Kaiser of Germany was not a man to be trifled with. Thus, Julie backed down and lowered his head upon hearing these words, an act that only gained contempt from the object of his affections. In fact, a mocking smile appeared on Itami's face as she spoke with vicious intent. The fact that you are willing to bow your head and swallow your pride at the mere mention of his name proves that you are unworthy of my attention. Enjoy your stay here in Heiankyo, because it will be the last time you ever set foot in my palace. The arrogance you displayed to me today has persuaded me to revoke your rights as an ambassador of your people. The next time your father wants to get in touch with me, tell him to send someone more respectful. After saying this, Itami walked off, leaving the Ming prince and his delegation in shock at what had just transpired. Ultimately, Julie's hopes of winning Itami's favor were thoroughly dashed, and he could only return home with his head hung in shame. Hans drove through the streets of Kufstein with complete disregard for his own safety. Currently, he was riding a motorcycle, with the Princess of Bavaria seated behind him. The princess wrapped her arms around the young Austrian prince, praying to the heavens for her own safety. A smile etched itself on the 13-year-old boy's face as he gripped the throttle and propelled himself through the city streets at high speeds. Hans had been granted permission to leave the Aerial Warfare Academy for the weekend to visit his family. He decided to bring in along to thoroughly outrage his most annoying fiancée. This was the first time the Bavarian princess would meet the boy's mother, and if she were not preoccupied with the terror that gripped her heart, she would be incredibly anxious about meeting the legendary Linda von Kufstein. In the past, Anne's father seldom spoke of his meetings with the von Kufstein family. Despite being the current king of Bavaria and a direct subordinate of the Kaiser, Diecker seemed to hold a great sense of dread towards the royal couple. When using such words, Diecker was referring to only two people, Berenger and Linda von Kufstein. Diecker once described to his daughter the power dynamics of the royal harem. Though Adela von Kufstein was the first Kaiserin in name, it was Linda who Berenger doted on the most and who controlled the other women in his life like a group of marionettes. It had been years since Anne first started developing a relationship with Hans, and though they had never officially declared their feelings for each other, Diecker knew his daughter had fallen for the boy. As a result, he had given her a stern warning about how to act in front of the second Kaiserin. Ultimately, this sense of anxiety finally revealed itself on the girl's pretty face when the motorcycle pulled up in front of the imperial palace. Hans did not seem the least bit concerned as he approached the building's gates and forced his way inside. Anne had no choice but to follow him, however, she did so meekly, afraid of what Linda might think of her. The moment Hans stepped inside, his mother confronted him. The busty red-headed beauty wrapped her arms around her teenage son's neck and buried his head in her ample bosom, expressing her delight. "My baby boy has finally returned." After saying this, she released her child from her embrace before adopting a stern tone. "You should know better than to worry your mother so much. I've heard about the risks you've been taking in your flight instruction. Don't make me pull you out of the Aerial Warfare Academy." As she spoke, her sharp gaze fell upon Anne. Despite this, she said nothing to the girl and instead waited for her son to respond. He was all too eager to do so. "Mom, even you can't get me out of the Aerial Warfare Academy. Once a man enrolls in a military academy, he signs away 12 years of his life to the military." Despite the accuracy of his words, Linda was far from persuaded and instead pulled on his ear, lecturing him further. "Don't be so sure about that, young man. I have my ways. If I really wanted to, I could have you transferred to Imperial Intelligence. Hema has been buried up to her eyeballs in work these days, and she could use a little helper." The idea of being transferred to Imperial Intelligence and spending 12 years of his life under his mother's watch sent a chill down Hans' spine, causing him to bow his head in submission and apologize for his reckless actions. "I'm sorry, Mother. It won't happen again." Linda gazed upon the submissive state of her son and sighed, expressing her discontent with his reckless behavior. "I swear, you are just like your father. Always jumping headfirst into unnecessary danger. If I had known you would grow up to be such a careless young man, I would have never allowed you to join the military." Hans merely scoffed at his mother's remarks before reminding her of the laws in place within the empire. "By the decree of my royal father, all young men must serve in the military for at least 4 years. Even if you wanted to keep me to yourself, you would not be able to convince father to make an exemption for me." Such words invoked fury in Linda's heart. She was well aware that Berenger had the ultimate say in how they raised their children. Even if she were to go on a hunger strike to force his hand, the man would not falter. He was as stubborn as he was reckless. All she could do was scold her son with a rather ineffective choice of words. "Don't talk back to your mother, young man. Now, are you going to introduce me to your little girlfriend or not?" At this moment, Anne stepped forward and curtsied before the Kaiserin, introducing herself. "Prinzessin von Wittelsbach, at your service, your majesty." Linda closely observed the girl for some time before nodding her head in approval. Her words shocked both Hans and Anne. "I like this one. She knows how to show respect. Unlike that Nordic woman who does nothing but lounge around and mooch off our family's good graces, this girl will make a good wife. I'll have to talk with Dietger about your relationship. In the meantime, welcome to our home. Make yourself comfortable while I go fetch Hans's other girls." After saying this, Linda quickly departed, allowing Anne to release the breath she had been holding in anxiety since introducing herself. She finally voiced her thoughts when she noticed Hans's gaze remained fixed on his mother's figure. "Your mother is really beautiful, but she is just as my father said, an utterly terrifying woman." In response, Hans chuckled before shifting his gaze to Anne. Wearing a gentle smile, he spoke about his mother with a hint of fondness in his tone. "At least she likes you. Trust me, if you find her intimidating now, wait until you do something to really upset her. I almost feel bad for Ingrid, because I just know my mother is scheming to get rid of the girl in the most humiliating way possible." And had no words for such a statement. Though Linda had been friendly to her, and still felt a suffocating pressure from the woman's gaze, as if her approval was the most important thing in the world. She pondered this when Linda returned to the room with Hans's other women. By now, Noemi and Veronica were both adults, while Natalia was the same age as Hans and was growing up to be a beauty in her own right. When gazed upon these young women, she felt a tad unworthy, as if their appearance was a step above her own. In reality, this was far from the case, but the doubt remained in the girl's heart. Noemi and Veronica hugged Hans at the same time, sandwiching him between their ample breasts. However, there was no perverted expression on the prince's face, as one might expect from a boy his age. Instead, he looked annoyed and pushed his two fiancées aside. "Enough. My mother has already smothered me. I don't need the same treatment from you too." The girls pouted as Natalia approached the young prince and hugged him as well. She seemed excited to see him, as it had been some time since his last visit to his family. "Hans, we missed you. Stop being a brat and accept our affection already." The only one who did not immediately move to smother Hans was Ingrid. She stood against the wall, gazing upon the scene with a hint of disdain. She had never accepted that the man she was supposed to marry had a harem. Now that he had brought another girl home, the young woman became even more vicious as she approached her fiancé and flicked his forehead. "You brought another girl home? What have I told you about falling prey to a bitch's schemes? You should be ashamed of yourself, Hans. Such blatant cheating cannot be tolerated." Linda was nearby and heard Ingrid's remarks. A look of displeasure appeared on her stunning face as she quickly swatted the woman on the bottom, causing Ingrid to yelp and stare at the red-headed beauty in fear. The Kaiserin was like a tigress protecting her cubs and was not afraid to get violent when Ingrid spoke out of turn. The subtle spanking did not go unnoticed by those who witnessed it. However, Linda acted as if it had never occurred and merely glared at Ingrid, forcing the girl to lower her head in submission. She steered the conversation elsewhere to avoid bringing up what had just happened. "Lunch will be ready soon, so how about you all follow me to the dining room? Your siblings will be joining us, Hans. It's been some time since you last saw them, and they are excited about your return. Ingrid, since you seem so displeased with our guest, you are not invited. Go back to your room and think about your actions." Ingrid felt wronged by this sudden change of events, but she merely gritted her teeth and bowed respectfully to Linda before doing as she was instructed. "Yes, Your Majesty." After Ingrid left, they all followed Linda toward the dining hall, where they would be met with a feast they were not expecting. After all, it was a chance for Linda to show off her cooking skills, and she had recently come up with a dish that she felt both her husband and eldest son were sure to enjoy. Unfortunately, Berengar was away on business and could not share this meal with the group. While Linda was having a conversation with Hans and his multiple fiancées, Berengar was enjoying himself across the world in a foreign kingdom, where he was treated as their most esteemed guest. Aside from Princess Angrani, who was sitting in his lap and feeding him local delicacies, several other beauties were attending to Berengar's every need at the feast. Despite the attention of the other women, Berengar was not the least bit interested. For a man like him, only the most beautiful princesses caught his interest. Every other woman on the planet was simply beneath his notice. Still, he did not shoo them away and allowed these noble women to play around with him, while the Majapahit king was forced to watch the shameful display of flirtation. As Berengar was enjoying himself, he shot a glance over towards King Suratman, who was surrounded by the fathers of these women. Each of them was a prominent nobleman, and many were opposing the efforts to centralize the Majapahit kingdom's authority under its monarch. As if to fan the flames, he posed a simple question to one of the girls, who was reaching her hand underneath his shirt to feel the definition of his abdominal muscles. "So tell me, sweetheart, what do you think about the potential Japanese invasion of your homeland? Are you perhaps scared?" Unknowingly, Berengar had posed this question to a prominent nobleman's daughter, one who bitterly refused to buy into the notion of an upcoming Japanese invasion, let alone cede her authority as a vassal to the Majapahit king. The woman was beautiful, though not quite in the same league as Angrani. However, she was happy that she had caught Berengar's attention and simply spoke her thoughts on the matter as if it were no big issue. "I've heard tales of Germany's strength. I'm sure that with such big, strong men protecting us, our people won't need to fear the Japanese and their petulant schemes. Isn't that the case?" However, Berengar's reaction shocked the woman, as he merely chuckled before responding to her and, by extension, her father. "Do you really believe I would deploy my army to protect you from Japan? I might be willing to sell your realm arms and munitions, but I have no intention of defending your kingdom from Empress Itami's avaricious gaze. That will be something you have to do yourselves." This response astonished the woman, her father, and the other nobles who had presumed the German fleet would counteract Japan's attacks. After all, the German military had taken up residence in their backyard. Surely that meant they had ambitions for the region? The woman's father gazed sternly at the Majapahit king, believing that perhaps it was Suratman who convinced Berengar not to intervene in their defense as a means of ensuring their submission. After glaring at his liege for several moments, he could no longer hold his silence. "What is the meaning of this? Do we not have an alliance with the German Empire? Is that not why you have ceded control of the Malacca Strait to their navy?" Suratman glowered at the unruly nobleman and was about to speak when Berengar did so on his behalf. "Alliance? I'm afraid you are mistaken. I merely promised to provide arms, munitions, and training to your troops at an affordable price. Though I have taken a liking to your princess, I have never made a defensive pact with your king. If your reason for resisting centralization of authority was because you thought I would send my forces to fight a war with Japan on your behalf, you have severely miscalculated the geopolitical situation. Make no mistake, the future of the Japanese armed forces relies on one critical resource." "How do I know this?" "Because my empire also uses it, and unlike Empress Itami, I have an ample supply of the mineral. Once the Japanese realize they can no longer access this resource from the Indian subcontinent, they will be faced with two options: invade the Ming dynasty or seize Borneo. Naturally, the Japanese will not invade the Ming dynasty. The Chinese have too much land and too many people. Any territory the Imperial Japanese Army gains would face stiff resistance from the local population. The fact is, the Japanese Empire lacks the manpower for a successful invasion of the Ming dynasty. Given this, Empress Itami will be left with only one option. Now that you know the truth, are you really willing to dismiss this as a mere hypothetical threat that doesn't require immediate action on your part? Whether your realm survives the upcoming war depends entirely on the level of cooperation you are willing to offer in defense against the Japanese. I can provide the means to resist, but I will not risk an all-out war with the Japanese Empire just for your sake." These words were like a massive bombshell, evoking an emotional response from all the noblemen and vassals present. Just as Berengar had said, their resistance to the centralization of authority was based on the false belief that the German military would come to their aid. Now presented with evidence to the contrary, they had to rethink their actions. Angreni smiled as she did the unthinkable and kissed Berenger on the lips with such passion in front of all her guests. Though they were aware of the relationship between the Kaiser and the Indonesian princess, they did not expect her to behave so shamefully in public. Berenger merely accepted the woman's kiss, twirling his tongue with hers for several seconds before breaking apart. Angreni then whispered something in his ear that no one else heard. "Well played. With a single speech, you have forced these old fogies into action. I must say, I am impressed." Berenger simply ignored her words before turning to the nobleman, whose daughters were now trembling with fear at the prospect of a Japanese invasion. "It is the dawn of a new era, gentlemen. Just as feudalism has gone extinct in Europe, you must face this reality. Power lies in the hands of kings, not the nobility. You can either peacefully hand over your authority to King Suratman, or he can bring your noble houses to ruin with the weapons and training I provide to his troops. I suggest you take a few moments to think about your choice." The nobles and vassals of the Majapahit Empire exchanged worried glances. Not all of them could swallow their pride and hand over their power so suddenly. They needed time to think carefully. There were even those who would rather die than give up the power they currently held. However, Berenger did not care about any of this. Instead, he was drinking wine from his glass while fondling Angreni's breasts. The woman was deeply embarrassed by this action but did not stop him. She knew better than to upset the Kaiser, and it was clear from the glint in his mismatched eyes that he was putting on a display of his authority. Even King Suratman gazed upon the sight of the foreign emperor groping his daughter in shock. Though he wanted to say something, he knew just how powerful the Reich was and did not dare utter a word of grievance. This alone told the king's errant subjects that if they were to cling to their feudal powers, it wasn't simply a matter of dealing with Suratman's personal forces. By taking such scandalous action in front of them, the Kaiser was practically declaring that he held the authority to decide their fates. The only sounds within the dining hall of the Majapahit palace were Angreni's muffled moans as she held her hand over her mouth, trying not to give voice to the pleasure she was receiving. Finally, Berenger halted his actions, and the room fell into sudden silence. He took another small sip of his wine before posing a question to all the Indonesian noblemen present. "So, have you come to a decision?" Upon realizing the capabilities of the Reich and the massive military base they had established in their backyard, not a single Majapahit vassal dared to voice a sound of disagreement. Instead, they rose from their seats and kowtowed before King Suratman, surrendering their feudal powers to their king. "We hereby declare our eternal loyalty to King Suratman and his bloodline. If you so desire to revoke our feudal powers, who are we to disagree?" Suratman was still shocked by the shamelessness Berenger had displayed a few minutes prior. However, though he did not want to admit it, the Kaiser had his ways of forcing people to submit to his will. After several moments of silence, the Majapahit king accepted his vassals' loyalty and officially incorporated their territories into a single state. In the following days, Berenger aided the Majapahit king as he stabilized his newfound power over his vassals. Feudalism within Indonesia met a swift end as the forces trained by Germany secured control over their territory and executed those who resisted the new order. After nearly a week of effort, Berenger left the Majapahit palace with his concubine and infant son in tow. They boarded the Kaiser's personal transport aircraft for a long flight back to Kufstein. With little effort, Berenger used one of his many properties to house Princess Angreni and her young son while hiring a staff of talented professionals to ensure all their needs were met. The woman was treated with the same care as her Aztec counterpart, living a life of utter luxury in the world's most advanced city. After spending some time with Angreni and their son Dharma, Berenger returned to the palace alone, where he quickly got to work on a critical piece of technology essential for the further advancement of the Reich. For some time, Berenger had invested extensively in science and engineering, and these investments had already paid off in numerous ways. With an entire community of Germany's greatest minds working together, new technologies were being discovered with each passing week. Among these inventions was the vacuum tube, which Germany's scientists had already widely adopted in fields such as radio, television, sound recording and reproduction, and long-distance telephone networks. Though Berenger knew how to create such devices on his own, his work in engineering was largely being superseded by his nation's scientists, allowing him to focus on important state matters. However, every now and then, much like today, he would take time out of his busy schedule to use his vast knowledge to advance certain fields of study. At the moment, he was using the basic technology behind vacuum tubes to create a first-generation computer, or at the very least, the design of such a device. Why was such a critical piece of technology necessary? Because it would allow a single man to complete a day's worth of calculations in just 20 minutes. This was monumental for civilian applications and the continued development of technology in general, but it also had significant military applications. For example, when used on naval vessels, this technology would enable the rapid calculation of a missile's trajectory, allowing Berenger to implement computer-based attack and defensive programs to use his anti-ship and anti-air missiles most effectively. These computers could also break ciphers, giving Germany a substantial advantage in the field of information during their upcoming war with the Japanese Empire. Vacuum tubes were used for logic circuitry, while magnetic cores were used for memory. This was achieved by using rings of semi-hard ferrite transformer cores, where each wire threaded through the core functioned as a transformer winding. 2 or more wires passed through each core, and magnetic hysteresis allowed each core to remember or store a state. By using magnetic core memory, Berenger's computers were already more advanced than those used during World War II in his past life. After reviewing the basic design several more times and perfecting any flaws, Berenger approved the document and sent it to the appropriate department to bring the design to life. After finishing his work on the computer design, Berenger decided to call it a day and walk through his palace. There, he found his eldest daughter, Helga, in the middle of painting. It was not unusual for the young girl to be engaged in such an activity, as she had a fascination with art ever since she was a child. However, her skills had vastly improved over the years, to the point where she could create photorealistic portraits. At first, he silently observed the girl's efforts until she noticed his presence. With a rather shy expression, she surprisingly called out to her father, who was just about to leave. "Father, if you're not too busy at the moment, do you mind if I paint you?" This sudden request slightly surprised Berenger. In the past, he had commissioned lavish portraits of himself and his family by Germany's most talented artists, but his daughter had never shown any interest in doing it herself. However, upon hearing such a request, Berenger could only smile and accept the offer. "Of course. I would be delighted if you would paint a portrait of me. However, do you mind if I change into something more military first?" The girl nodded silently, her eyes never wavering from her father's figure. Upon receiving approval, Berenger silently left the room and tidied himself in his military uniform. Until now, every portrait he had commissioned was of him dressed in extravagant noble attire. However, since his daughter was doing the painting this time, he wanted to give her something special. Thus, he dressed in his Reichsmarshal's uniform, with his greatcoat over it. Atop his greatcoat was a black leather Sam Brown-style belt, with his holster containing a P-27 pistol. The only medal visible was his Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, which hung gracefully from his neck. After adorning himself in this military uniform, Berenger returned to the room where his daughter was waiting. Upon seeing her father reappear in his military uniform, a glint of fascination appeared in Helga's blue eyes, yet there was no smile on her lips. As if she were too shy to show any emotion in front of her own father, she gave him a simple command. "Please, sit." Berenger did as he was instructed and wore a charming smile as he sat down in a fine oak chair, where he waited for his eldest daughter to paint his portrait. He held his cap in his lap as he sat there in silence. Some time had passed before the door to the room abruptly opened, revealing the lithe figure of one of Berenger's other daughters. The 7-year-old child had a magnificent smile on her face as she rushed over to her father and jumped into his lap, expressing her glee. "Daddy, Daddy! Come play with me." Berenger smiled as he stroked Zara's sandy hair. The girl had been born with her mother's amber eyes and tan skin, but her hair took after her father, albeit diluted from a pure gold to a less saturated color. Among all of Berenger's children, only Zara could match Hans in terms of sheer intelligence. Though Berenger spent as much time as he could manage with his family, he could only spare so many hours of the day, and he had too many children to distribute his time evenly among. As much as he wanted to entertain the girl, he had promised to sit still for the portrait for Helga, who rarely approached him for company. Thus, he could only sigh and reject the girl. However, before he could do so, something peculiar happened. Helga, who was already in her preteens, showed the first bit of human emotion Berenger had seen on her doll-like face since the day she was born. She pouted at her little half-sister and spoke up on her own behalf. "Zara, please leave father be. He is spending time with me right now." Zara was confident that she could easily steal her father away from Helga. Thus, she put on a deliberately childish act, fitting her age as she shook her head and stuck out her tongue before refusing Helga's request. "I don't wanna." After saying this, the girl shifted her gaze toward her father and innocently looked to the side as if she were in trouble. "Daddy! Why won't you come play with me? Are you mad at Zara?" The sight of his daughter practically in tears nearly broke Berenger's heart. He honestly did not know the girl well enough to understand that she was just manipulating him. However, Helga knew the truth about her younger sister's personality and bit her lip in displeasure. She wanted to speak up and assert that her father had promised to spend time with her, but her anxiety held her tongue. Berenger's spirit of resistance ultimately broke as he petted Zara's hair and came up with a compromise he believed would work. "How about this? You sit here on Daddy's lap, and the two of us will get painted by your sister together?" Zara immediately agreed to this suggestion. After all, she was able to sit in her father's lap, something she knew Helga desperately wanted to do but was too shy and too old to actually accomplish. She nodded her head with a cheeky smile on her cute face. "Sure." However, just as Zara said these words, an ugly expression appeared on Helga's face as she shouted at the top of her lungs for the first time in her life. "No. Absolutely not. I am painting father, and father alone. He promised me he would let me paint him. Now get out of here, Zara, you're being a nuisance." Both Berenger and Zara were surprised by this turn of events. The man had never seen his usually quiet and reserved daughter respond so explosively. Clearly, she took her painting very seriously. Or so he thought. In reality, she had worked up the courage for the first time to spend time with her father, whom she knew to be an important man, and he had agreed. So no matter what, she would not let any of her siblings steal this precious time away from her, no matter the cost. Berenger did not know how strongly the girl felt about this minor dispute, but he could tell by her outburst that Helga was serious about the matter. Thus, he sighed as he lifted Zara off his lap, petted the girl's sandy hair once more, and sent her on her way. "Zara, this painting means a lot to your sister. So I will fulfill my promise to her. I'll come find you after we're finished and play with you as much as you desire. So until then, just wait for me, okay?" Zara pouted but nodded her head in silence. She had never believed that Helga would stand up for herself like she did today. The girl had to admit she had miscalculated and could only accept her defeat. The last thing Zara wanted was for her father to think she was a spoiled brat. Thus, she walked out of the room, but only after making her father promise to spend time with her after the painting was over. "Daddy, remember your promise. Okay? I won't forgive you if you forget about me." After saying this, Zara left, and Berenger resumed his pose, though this time he had difficulty maintaining his smile. As for Helga, she was just relieved that her father did not abandon her to spend time with one of her other siblings. And though her painting didn't turn out as she hoped, given her model's poor mood, she could be happy knowing that she managed to paint her father's portrait at least once in her life. Zara pouted as she strolled through the halls of the imperial palace. Despite her young age, or perhaps because of it, the little girl was as brilliant as she was mischievous. She enjoyed using her adorable facade to manipulate others into lavishing her with praise and affection. However, there was one person whose attention she desired most of all, her father. Like all of Berenger's children, Zara knew that he was the most powerful person in the world. Unfortunately, that also meant he was dreadfully busy all 7 days of the week. There were only so many hours in the day he could spend with his family, and much of that time was spent with his multiple women. Berenger's children had to compete for his love and affection. Zara knew this well, and when she was not in school, she often waited outside her father's office door, hoping to be the first to capture his attention the moment he finished his work. However, Zara was not expecting him to take a half day, which was rare in his line of work. Before she could meet up with her father and monopolize his free time, Helga had struck first. Now Zara was in a pitiful mood, despite her father promising to spend time with her after he finished being painted by his eldest daughter. Zara knew it was entirely possible that some other matter would come up, and he would be forced to neglect her. As a result, she was sulking in her room alone when her mother appeared in the doorway. Yasmin was the only one of Berenger's wives who was older than he was. She was currently in her mid-30s and was going through a crisis, feeling that she could no longer have another child. Thus, she spent the overwhelming majority of her days with the few children she had. When she saw her only daughter in a sour mood, the caring woman approached the girl and inquired about what had caused her distress. "Zara, what's wrong? You look like you're about to cry." The girl sniffled, as if to choke back the tears pooling in her amber eyes, before responding to her mother's question. "It's nothing, Mother. I just fear that Daddy won't be able to spend any time with me today, like most days." Stupid Helga, why does she get to him first? Yasmin understood her daughter's feelings well. It was not only Berenger's children who competed for his affection, his wives often vied with one another for intimacy. Some had even adopted strategies of pairing together. Adela and Henrietta, the most notable duo, almost always spent time together with Berenger rather than alone by his side. The mature Moorish beauty could only sigh and wrap her arms around her daughter before whispering some advice in her ear. "If you want your father to pay attention to you, you need to do something that will draw his attention. Helga gets your father's love because she is a talented painter, and Hans because he is a brilliant young man who has pursued a similar path to his father. You are just as intelligent as that boy, but rather than apply yourself to a field your father can take pride in, you use your wits to manipulate people. Perhaps you should find something you enjoy doing that your father will also want to participate in. You're still young, so you have plenty of time to spend with your father. I don't believe you should be so worried about chasing after him." Zara nodded her head and wiped the tears from her eyes. Just as she was about to say something to her mother, Berenger entered the room and gazed at the emotional scene of his wife and daughter, both with depressed looks in their eyes. He couldn't help but wonder if he had done something to offend them. "Am I interrupting something?" The moment Zara heard her father's voice, her sadness dispersed, and a warm smile appeared on her face as she ran out of her mother's arms, attempting to tackle Berenger with a hug. "Daddy!" Berenger chuckled as he caught the young girl and lifted her in the air, swinging her around. Her golden dress swayed as she spun. Berenger kissed her on the forehead before setting her down. "So, Zara, now that Daddy is finished spending time with your sister, what did you want me to do?" Zara was about to make a request when she noticed her mother's exhausted expression. She decided to change her plans to something that would include the three of them. "I want Mommy and Daddy to take me to the park." The way the girl referred to her mother was different when her father was in the room. This was something only Yasmin knew, as she had kept the girl's hyperintelligence a secret from Berenger. After all, in Berenger's eyes, Zara was just an adorable little girl, and Yasmin wanted him to keep that perspective for as long as possible. After hearing her daughter speak up on her behalf, a pretty smile appeared on Yasmin's lips as she nodded and responded to the girl's request. "If it's not too much trouble, I would be happy to accompany you two to the park." Berenger thought about it for a few moments before nodding in agreement. "Sure, it sounds like a great idea." After saying that, Berenger, Yasmin, and Zara headed out from the palace and took the royal car to the local park, where the families of Kufstein gathered to enjoy their time off. Everyone present was shocked when they saw the Kaiser and one of his wives appear with the young girl in tow. However, they did not dare approach the man, as an armed unit protected him and his family at all times. After entering the public park, Zara saw that one of the swings was free and quickly ran up to it with a wide smile on her cute face. "Daddy, I want a swing," the girl said in the most childlike tone she could manage. Berenger chuckled as he held Yasmin's hand and nodded his head, agreeing to the girl's request. "Sure, Zara, why not?" The sight of the Kaiser pushing his young daughter on the swing was forever embedded in the minds of those who witnessed it. Right now, Berenger did not look like the emperor of the German people. Instead, he looked like an average, loving father. The dignity and grace of an emperor were missing, replaced by the compassionate expression of a young man doting on his daughter. Zara's heart fluttered as her father pushed her on the swing, calling out to him to put in more effort.
Higher. Daddy, push me higher.
Berenger did as he was told and pushed the girl with a bit more strength. The playground equipment was designed with safety in mind, so Berenger was free to push the girl to her heart's content. Yasmin gazed upon the heartwarming scene and felt thankful that her daughter had dragged her along on this occasion. It was not every day that Berenger could cherish his children as he did today, and it warmed the mature beauty's heart to see that the man she married still had such a compassionate side.
Ultimately, Berenger, Yasmin, and Zara spent the rest of the daylight hours at the park, enjoying their time together as a family.
As for Helga, she sat alone in her room, gazing at the portrait she had painted of her father with a satisfied smile. On this day, Berenger had made two of his daughter's dreams come true, and he didn't even realize it.
Alexandros had a stern expression on his youthful face as he looked at the menu with intense focus.
The lines on his forehead clearly showed he was having difficulty choosing something to eat. Meanwhile, his father, far from impatient, gazed around the room with a hint of nostalgia in his mismatched eyes. After several minutes of indecision, the boy put down the menu and sighed, voicing his frustrations.
I don't know what to get.
A simple snort echoed in the air as Helena, with a look of contempt on her doll-like face, retorted to her brother's statement.
That's no surprise. You never know what to order whenever we go out to eat. In fact, if not for dear old Mommy Linda, you would have probably starved to death by now. Alexandros's face grew red with both embarrassment and frustration at his sister's venomous words. Their father, however, watched their interaction with a bit of amusement before addressing the boy's behavior. Alexandros, one day you will rule over the Byzantine Empire, and a monarch needs to be decisive in everything he does. However, you're still young, and since you can't decide what to eat on your own, do you mind if I suggest something? The boy nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on his sister. Go ahead.
Berenger smiled and pointed to a picture representing the meal he intended to have. It's a foot-long crispy buffalo chicken sandwich, with pepper jack cheese, bacon bits, and ranch dressing. For an appetizer, I thought we could all share a round of buffalo wings. How does that sound? Upon hearing his father's recommendation, Alexandros nodded in agreement. However, his excitement was ruined by Helena's next remarks. That sounds really good. I'll have one too. After hearing her words, he could only glare at his sister, knowing that her reason for selecting that particular sandwich was just to irritate him. Despite their squabbling over petty things, Berenger had noted the order. When the waitress arrived, he was surprised to see a familiar face. A woman in her 40s, dressed in casual clothes, gazed at the Kaiser and his two children. Her face showed a hint of emotion that only Berenger could recognize. Struggling to find her voice, she curtsied before the Kaiser, a man she had known since he was a small boy. My Kaiser, it is an honor to have you in my establishment once more. Can I take your order, or do you three need more time to decide? Berenger shook his head and smiled, handing over the menus to the woman. He gave her their order, then posed a personal question. Helga, I'm surprised to see you still working in this old shop. As far as I know, you and your husband have opened locations all across the Reich. Yet you still undertake such mundane tasks as serving? A smile spread across the woman's face when she realized that Berenger still remembered her, which dispelled the worry she had. It was over a decade ago that the man first introduced the sandwich to Austrian cuisine. She and her husband had invested in opening the world's first sandwich shop, a place where Berenger had taken Adela on their first date at this very location. The woman wanted to tell the Kaiser all about how he had changed her life for the better, but she could see he was sharing a meal with two of his children. Thus, she decided to briefly detail why she was acting as a waitress that night. One of my girls had a family emergency, so I decided to pick up her shift. My husband typically runs the daily operations of the chain, while I act as manager in the original location. As for your orders, they will be right out. Please enjoy your stay. Helena gazed at her father with curiosity, wondering why he had taken them to the old quarter of town, which still maintained the fretwork architecture popular in the preceding era. She couldn't believe he had a connection to this woman. Berenger noticed how his daughter was eyeing him and chuckled before explaining his relationship with Helga.
Helga was one of the original inhabitants of Kufstein back when it was just a small farming town.
You may not be aware of how unimportant our family's lands were until just 13 years ago, but the thriving metropolis you see today didn't exist then.
Anyway, that's not why I brought the two of you out to dinner. I want to talk to you about your mother.
The air grew stale as both Alexandros and Helena squashed their petty rivalry for a moment and instead glared at their father together. They loved the man, despite his busy schedule and large family. The fact that he was able to spend so much time with them was a blessing. But these two siblings agreed on one thing: Anuria was the worst among their mothers. Unfortunately, she was the one who had given birth to them. Berenger could tell they were displeased with his words and sighed heavily as he took a sip from his liter of beer. He wiped the foam from his mouth before addressing the largest issue at hand. I know the two of you are not exactly the biggest fans of your mother.
Alexandros more so than you, Helena.
I'm not going to excuse the fact that she was not the most present part of your upbringing. However, your mother is looking to put that behind her and be a proper parent to you and your younger brother. I'm not asking the two of you to forgive her for her neglect. I just want you to give her a second chance. By all means, you two can still consider Linda or any other of my wives as your actual mother, but I want you both to know that Anuria cares about the two of you, even if she doesn't always show it. Before the two siblings could speak, Helga returned with a tray full of buffalo wings and several platters of blue cheese and ranch dipping sauce. Berenger had a wide smile on his face as he saw this and thanked the woman for her efforts.
Thanks, I'm sure my kids will enjoy these.
The woman smiled and nodded before departing, allowing the trio to eat their meal in peace. Berenger did not wait for his kids' answers and immediately dipped one of the buffalo wings into the ranch dressing before taking a bite of its chunky meat. Alexandros and Helena stared at each other. They both had words they wanted to say, but they were also both hungry. Thus, they decided to wait until after they had eaten their meal to give their father an answer. It would also allow them to think about their response. After Helena ate her first hot wing, Berenger noticed that she had a bit of sauce on her face and dabbed it off with his napkin. The girl pouted as she scolded her father for stealing her sauce.
Daddy! I was going to lick that.
Berenger merely chuckled and licked the napkin to further tease her before taking a bite of another buffalo wing.
Too late.
Eventually, the sandwiches appeared, and the two siblings devoured the food with gusto.
They both very much enjoyed their father's selection. It was only after every scrap of food was eaten that Berenger gazed sternly at his children and asked for their answers. So, how about it? Are you willing to give your mother a second chance?
The two kids stared at each other, and silently nodded their heads before Helena spoke up on her brother's behalf. We will give Mother another chance, but not for her sake.
Berenger's brow raised a little as he immediately followed up with a question. Oh, is that so? Then may I ask for whose sake are you willing to do it?
In the next moment, the two kids voiced their thoughts at the same time, as if they shared the same mind. Yours. Berenger washed down the spicy meal with the rest of his beer before attempting to respond to this bold statement. After doing so, he sighed heavily before praising the two kids for their generosity. I must say, I have two great kids. If they're both willing to overlook their mother's faults for my sake. Very well, when your mother returns from her journey, we will all go out to eat together as a family. After saying this, Berenger paid the bill and gave Helga a rather big tip in the form of a 1,000-mark bill. Despite running a successful chain of restaurants, he still felt the obligation to generously tip his server. After all, he had so much wealth that a mere 1,000 marks were nothing compared to the service and meal he had received. After doing so, Berenger led his children back to the car, where members of the Leibgard were ready to escort them to the palace. Although Alexandros and Helena had not forgiven their mother for being absent during their childhood, they decided to give her a second chance. After all, they still had many years left as children, and it would be a waste to give up on their biological mother so early in life. While Berenger was spending time with his family, Anuria was about to reach the shores of Australia. The corvette led the formation, flanked by several destroyers, and protected by two submarines beneath the ocean's surface. After what felt like an eternity at sea, Anuria and her crew were about to set foot on the soil. soil that had been untouched by human civilization and was ripe for the taking. Upon seeing the land in the distance, Honoria inserted her magazine into her submachine gun's mag well and racked the bolt back, chambering around. Nobody knew what awaited them in this foreign land, and Honoria's experiences with native populations ranged from outright hostility to potential friendliness. What she did know was that whoever dwelled on this massive landmass had little, if any, contact with the outside world. No longer were there wooden rowboats for Honoria and her crew to reach the shore. Instead, ribs, rigid-hull inflatable boats, were the primary choice of landing craft for the corvette and the accompanying destroyers. The front of these ribs were mounted with MG-27 general-purpose machine guns, modeled after the MG-42 from Berenger's past life. This mounted weapons platform ensured firepower capable of defeating anything the crew might encounter in this part of the world. Luckily, the team did not need to use the weapon as they safely approached the shore with Honoria in the lead. Shortly thereafter, the Marine detachment from the destroyers deployed in a similar manner. All in all, several hundred people from the Reich now stood upon the shores of what was once known as Australia in Berenger's past life. The moment the Marines landed, they unfurled a flag of the Reich and stuck it into the ground, claiming the entire continent for themselves. Though it may seem like a small action, it was the first step in Berenger's plan, of which Honoria was an integral part. Over the following days, the German Marines and privateers began construction of a small military base. In the typical fashion of Germany's early colonization efforts, the base established was a small star fort made mostly of timber. This fort served as their means of defense against local populations and as proof of settlement for any international claims Germany might make in the near future. As the German Marines were constructing the base and the accompanying dockyard, Honoria and her girls began to explore deeper inland. Berenger had explicitly warned the women about the sheer amount of dangers in Australia. These included poisonous snakes, spiders, and octopuses, saltwater crocodiles, heavyweight kangaroos, and, of course, the dreaded emu. And that was just the wildlife. If one were in a joking mood, they might even suggest that the land of Australia itself wanted to snuff out all the human life within its borders. Thus, Honoria's expeditions further inland were done with a bit of caution. It did not take long for Honoria and her girls to come across one of these fabled beasts, especially considering they were operating out of the back of a Kübelwagen. Honoria was in the middle of taking photos of herself and her girls as the car drove through the westernmost portion of the Australian outback. The loud roar of the vehicle's diesel engine sent a nearby pack of kangaroos into a panic, leaping away from the group of Western women. The girl mounted the machine gun on the back of Honoria's car, aimed at the fleeing animals, and was about to pull the trigger when Honoria stopped her. Honoria's pretty face showed a stern gaze as she scolded the woman for the unnecessary violence. "What do you think you're doing? They're obviously not a threat right now. Don't shoot unless you have to." The woman looked down in shame, nodded, and lowered the weapon, ensuring she wouldn't accidentally fire at the native wildlife. It wasn't until they reached the limit of their vehicle's range that the small convoy of women came to a stop. Honoria sighed and began to apply her makeup before giving an order to the girls in the convoy. "Fill up the tank with the jerry cans. I suppose we should head back now. We haven't seen any natives, so perhaps this land is entirely uninhabited." While making this statement, Honoria didn't know that a group of aboriginals were hiding in the nearby bushes, gazing upon the white women with complicated expressions. They didn't know who these foreigners were, why they had come to this land, or what kind of vehicle they were using to move through the outback. After all, they had yet to invent the wheel, let alone steel, rubber, or the combustion engine. One of the hidden aboriginals stepped back in a hint of panic and landed on a dry branch, which cracked beneath his weight, signaling to the women that they were not alone. Honoria immediately stashed away her makeup and mirror, unslung her MP-27 machine gun, and aimed it toward the direction of the noise. She didn't have time to deploy the underfolding stock and simply held it forward with the tension of the sling. As for the girl on the mounted MG, she also aimed down the weapon sights and pointed it in the direction where the branch had broken, though she would not fire until her captain gave the order. Honoria narrowed her gaze and called out in German, not knowing which language the local population spoke or if intelligent life surrounded her. "Come out with your hands up. I will count to 3. If you do not reveal yourselves by then, don't blame me for being impolite." After saying this, Anuria called out to the girls refueling the cars.
Hurry up! I don't want to be stranded out here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by savages.
After saying this, she began to count.
1. Yet, not a single movement could be detected. 2.
Still, not a single voice could be heard.
3.
Finally, after 3 breaths, Anuria held down the trigger of her submachine gun and unloaded its magazine into the bush blindly. The moment she did, screams filled the air, indicating that she had indeed hit something. The moment Anuria started firing, the mounted gunners and those members of the convoy who were not refueling noticed movement. With the first gunshots, the aboriginals emerged with wooden spears in hand, less than 30 meters away.
Anuria deemed them a threat. Kill them all.
With this order, thousands of rounds flowed from the mounted general-purpose machine guns and the handheld submachine guns, ruthlessly gunning down the 24 men who had approached the foreign convoy. Anuria spat on the ground, reloaded her weapon, and raised her hand in the air, signaling her girls to halt their actions. Doing so, she sent a few girls to check the bush for any survivors.
Check it out.
After her command, a small squad of young women walked through the bush and found several corpses riddled with bullet holes, their blood oozing onto the dirt beneath them. However, there were no survivors. Having confirmed this, the women returned to the convoy, now fully refueled and ready for action. They're all dead, nothing but a bunch of Stone Age savages.
Typical.
Upon hearing this, Anuria knew the natives posed no threat to her or the rest of the landing party.
She gave the order to return to the encampment.
All right, fall back. For now, we will report what we have found to the Marines.
It is up to them to establish operational security. I think we have learned enough.
After saying this, she hopped back into her wagon, and the convoy departed, heading back to the encampment by the shore. They left behind a pile of corpses that would confuse any aboriginals who came across them. Word quickly spread of the Japanese Empire's conquest of Maguindanao, leading the Ming Emperor to call a meeting with the German embassy in Beijing. Currently, Ambassador Gerhard von Gres sat in his seat, attended to by 2 young Chinese women. These girls were twins, and they poured a cup of tea for their master with the utmost grace and civility. After filling his cup, they turned to the Ming prince and did the same for him before scurrying off out of earshot.
Indeed, it was the Ming prince in attendance.
Although the emperor had called for this meeting, he would not dignify a mere ambassador with his presence. Thus, he had sent his son, Prince Julie, to speak with Gerhard. The German ambassador was accustomed to meeting with the crown prince. Unfortunately, Zhu Ji, the general in charge of the conquest of Indochina, was unavailable. Therefore, his younger brother, who had previously served as ambassador to Japan, was reassigned to speak with the Reich's representative. Julie was not a tenth of the man his elder brother was. He was neither intelligent nor cunning and had a misplaced sense of pride, both in himself and his family's empire. This, combined with his low intellect, made for a rather laughable ambassador.
It was no wonder he had failed miserably to move Empress Itami's heart.
Though Gerhard was aware of the rumors surrounding the young prince, he still treated the young man with respect. After all, he could not afford to damage relations with the Ming dynasty. He had already committed one grave mistake against the Kaiser in years past, and spent nearly a decade making up for it.
Now that he had a comfortable position in Beijing, why would he risk it?
Thus, the man's tone was filled with reverence as he spoke with the haughty prince.
It is my pleasure to host your highness. Tell me, Prince Li, what is so urgent that I must clear my schedule for this meeting?
Julie was entirely unaware of how advanced the German nation had become. He knew nothing of their supreme military might, which even the Japanese empress feared deep within her heart. The prince also had a general disdain for Germans and what he perceived as their air of arrogance. In other words, his ignorance and pride caused him to behave in a less than friendly manner when Gerhard spoke to him.
Who do you think you are? You cleared your busy schedule for me? As if that is supposed to be a problem?
You should feel blessed that I decided to grace an ambassador from a backwater nation like you with my presence. You have no right to speak to me with such a tone, barbarian.
Gerhard was surprised by the Ming prince's behavior.
After all, he had spoken with no intention of offense.
He had heard stories that the man was rather incompetent, but he never imagined it was to such a degree. When Julie was enchanted by Itami's beauty, he had never raised his voice to her. Even if she was a barbarian, he would never say such uncouth words to her pretty face. However, at the moment, he was speaking to a man from the Western world. How could a man as esteemed as a Ming prince possibly hold his tongue for such a person? Despite the misunderstanding that had just occurred, Gerhard did not grovel or beg for the Ming prince's forgiveness. He could not afford to sully the reputation of the Reich and its glorious Kaiser, even in a private conversation between two ambassadors. After all, Germany only treated the Ming as an equal because they did not wish to worsen relations between them and East Asia, which they had no long-term ambitions for. If Berenger really wanted to, he could utterly crush the Ming dynasty with his vast military power. As a result, Gerhard's tone lacked all respect when he responded to the Ming prince's harsh words. If this is how you speak to foreign ambassadors, it's no wonder you were kicked out of Empress Itami's palace. Though why your father would send such an utter buffoon to my residence is beyond me. Perhaps he was hoping you would reflect on your previous actions and learn from your mistakes. It is clear the man has put too much faith in you. Let's cut the bullshit. You're here because your father is worried about the Han minority within the islands that the Japanese Empire is currently invading. The Ming Emperor is concerned that if the Imperial Japanese Army were to push even slightly north, they would be attacking another Ming tributary. He wants to know our stance on the issue. Julie's expression soured when he heard this. He was about to open his mouth when Gerhard interrupted him after taking a sip of his tea. Judging by the look on your face, I'm right, aren't I? Let's save us all some time. Allow me to convey to you our Kaiser's will. It is his belief that should Empress Itami send her forces northward towards Kowloon, the only solution is economic sanctions. Withholding trade from the Japanese would cripple their economy, forcing Empress Itami to print large quantities of paper currency to compensate. This would most certainly cause hyperinflation, leading to future problems for her empire. The Kaiser will do his part to rally his allies to agree to these economic sanctions. However, if we wish our response to be truly effective, the Ming dynasty, as the Japanese Empire's largest trading partner, will have to cut off all trade with Empress Itami. I'm sure you have no idea what I'm talking about, but if you repeat my words to your father, he will understand the Kaiser's intent. Now, were there any other questions your father had for me, or do you plan to continue to waste my precious time? Gerhard's words deeply offended Julie. It was one thing for Itami to kick him out of her palace. As angry as he was when she had done so, he could tolerate it. However, this Western barbarian was asking for a beheading. Thus, the Ming prince rose from his seat with a fierce glint in his eyes and rebuked the German ambassador for his vicious remarks. You will come to regret your words today. I, Julie, am not a man you can so easily afford to offend. I will be back, and when I do, I will have your tongue removed. Gerhard was not the least bit intimidated. The Ming Emperor needed Germany's aid to resist the rising threat of the Japanese Empire. Because of this, Gerhard could fearlessly provoke the foolish prince. However, to ensure that the prince did not deliberately misinform his father out of spite, the German ambassador made one final remark before sending the Ming prince on his way. Just for the record, I will send an accurate report of our discussion today to your father in a few hours. I'm sure he would appreciate a written copy for his records. Consider this a gift from the Kaiser. Julie's face turned ghastly when he heard this, wondering in that moment how he could have been seen through. It was exactly this clown's intent to return to his father and say that Germany intended to do nothing, offering no suggestions whatsoever, before rudely sending the Ming ambassador packing. Gerhard had enough experience with dullards and fools to understand their thought processes. Thus, he could accurately predict and preempt Julie's intended actions with a single sentence. Ultimately, the Ming prince was speechless as he stormed out of the German embassy in a huff. He swore that one day he would exact his vengeance on Gerhard and the Reich as a whole for treating him this way. As for the German ambassador, he sat back in his seat and sipped his tea in silence. The two Chinese maids from earlier entered the room and kowtowed before their master. There was a look of worry on their faces as they silently conveyed their concerns. Ultimately, the elder of the twins spoke up and inquired about the sincerity of the situation. Master, is something wrong?
A slight sneer appeared on Gerhard's face as he placed his teacup on the saucer on the table. A clank resonated in the air as he shifted his gaze to the two women and glared sternly at them before responding to their question.
Send a message to Imperial Intelligence. Prince Julie is going to be a problem.
The two Chinese maids had worked for the German embassy long enough to understand the weight of these words.
They silently nodded their heads before departing from the room.
One of the young women entered a secret room and sent an encrypted radio message back to the Reich, informing them of the German ambassador's words. As for Julie's ultimate fate, that was up to Linda to decide. For now, both the German Empire and the Ming Dynasty would watch and wait to see how the Japanese Empire proceeded with their invasion of the Philippines. One wrong step, and they could find themselves buried under international sanctions.
While Berenger was spending time with his loving family, Itami was utterly alone.
Although it was true that she had her mother and sister looking after her, the woman was more annoyed by these two family members than comforted by their presence. However, today was not a day that Itami could sit back and wallow in her loneliness. Instead, she had to get ready early in the morning and dress herself in her nicest attire. Why did she have to do this? Because after nearly 2.5 years of development, today was the day that Japan's first power plant had finished construction. Unlike Germany, which was filled with rivers that could be used to generate clean and renewable electricity, Japan did not have such a luxury and was, for the time being, forced to rely on coal. Now that her workers had completed the construction of the first power plant, she could provide electricity to Heiankyo, which would greatly improve her workers' efficiency. She could employ workers on rotational shifts, with some of them working through the night to complete their industrial projects. While the German Empire was a state where common citizens enjoyed the benefits of labor protection laws, countless luxuries, and a vibrant economy, the Japanese Empire was the exact opposite. It had become an industrial slave state, where citizens considered themselves lucky if they could eat 3 bowls of rice a day. Work conditions in Japan were abysmal, and there had been no major shift in the social structure.
The samurai clans continued to dominate as the primary landowners.
However, rather than being a class of feudal lords and warriors as they were in the past, they now enjoyed the pampered lives of wealthy industrialists. Meanwhile, the peasant class still existed, but the majority of them had been shifted from the fields to the factories, which continued to support the ever-increasing Japanese war machine. It was debatable who in Japanese society had it worse. The young conscripts, forced at gunpoint to fight and die in foreign lands for natural resources that could have been obtained through trade, or the middle-aged factory workers who toiled endlessly for meager pay. Much of their meager salaries were spent entirely within company stores, whose inflated prices were designed to keep the peasant class in mounting debt. The only reason this dystopia had not collapsed was due to the fear with which Itami Ryo ruled over her people. While Berenger was a beloved figure to the German people, the Japanese saw their empress as a merciless tyrant and a vicious despot. Itami was fully aware of these criticisms, though she disagreed with them entirely. The young empress genuinely believed that forcing Japan to unify under her banner and industrialize rapidly was an achievement worthy of the history books. She maintained that the suffering of her people was necessary to achieve global dominance. Only after Japan was without a rival could she focus on the welfare of her people. These were the thoughts the young woman was having as she dressed in a rather elegant gown. For some time, she had worn a military uniform in public as a show of force. However, today was not a military occasion, but a civilian achievement. As a result, she had chosen a pretty dress as a peaceful statement to her people. Despite being in a Cold War with Germany, Itami had to admit their fashion sense was extravagant. She could not easily introduce such revealing designs to her population without backlash from the more conservative members of her society. Therefore, she had purchased a few exquisite dresses from the Reich in secret. She couldn't decide whether to wear a blood-red princess-style gown or a snow-white lacy cocktail dress. While Itami was in nothing but her underwear, she held up the 2 dresses toward her Julian love pillow and asked the inanimate object for its opinion.
"Julian, what do you think? Which should I wear to the event today?" Utter silence filled the room. However, in Itami's mind, she could practically see the man pondering the question before giving her his honest thoughts. To an outside observer, nothing was said between the question and Itami's response a moment later. I agree. The white dress will go better with my hair. Thanks, Julian, you always had great taste in aesthetics.
After saying this, Itami hugged the pillow, tossed the blood-red gown aside, and slipped into the lacy white cocktail dress. Once fully dressed, she put on a pair of white leather heels and strutted around the room. She posed another question to the pillow.
What do you think?
Silence prevailed for several moments, but this time, the woman responded to her own question in a peculiar way. She shifted her gaze to the painting of Berenger and frowned, scolding it.
Not you. I was talking to Julian.
Almost immediately, a smile erupted on Itami's flawless face, and she rushed over to the pillow, hugged it, and planted a kiss on where its lips would be if it were a human. She snuggled in its arms for a moment before responding to the inanimate object's non-existent answer. You're the best. As Itami enjoyed herself in her delusional state, a knock resonated on the door, followed by her mother's sultry voice.
Ryo, we are leaving in 5 minutes. Don't be late for this event.
Itami frowned and spoke to her pillow in a hushed voice so her mother wouldn't hear.
I'll be back soon, Julian. Please wait for me.
After saying this, she rushed out the door and down towards the great hall, where her mother and sister were waiting for her. The two women were dressed in yukatas and were surprised by Itami's rather liberal attire.
Momo pouted jealously, her eyes drawn to the exquisite craftsmanship of Itami's Western-style dress. Nechan, where did you get that?
Itami panicked, not wanting it known that she had abused her authority to smuggle German fashion into her personal wardrobe. Despite her best efforts, she was a terrible liar and looked away before making something up on the spot.
Oh, this?
I had my tailor make it especially for this occasion. Though Momo was naive enough to believe her elder sister's words, their mother was not so easily fooled. She could immediately tell that Itami had done something rather scandalous to obtain such a fine dress of foreign design. However, the mature beauty did not comment on this and instead sighed before walking down the palace steps with her two daughters in tow. The trio was flanked by an entire battalion of soldiers, who protected them as they marched through the streets towards the new power plant. Berenger's Leibgard was more of a redundancy than a practical necessity, as the people of Germany loved him and his family so much that it was highly unlikely anyone would attempt to harm them. Because of this, the Kaiser only kept a few of his most elite soldiers to protect him and his family when they were out and about throughout the Reich. It was somewhat like the United States Secret Service in his past life.
However, for Itami, things were vastly different.
Many within Japanese society despised the Empress, and because of this, when she traveled through the streets, the roads were cleared entirely, and 1,000 soldiers of her royal guard protected her from any potential threats. Ultimately, she and her family arrived unharmed at the power plant, where she gave a brief speech about Japanese advancement and the need for unity during these troubling times. For some, the Empress's words resonated and dispelled some of their internal resentment. For others, the speech fell on deaf ears. In the end, Itami cut the ribbon and opened Japan's first power plant, which would soon provide electricity throughout the capital of the Japanese Empire. Anuria sat on the beach with a cigarette in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She had recently returned from the Outback and had already reported her findings to the commander of the Marine detachment that accompanied her and her team on this perilous journey. As a result, the small outpost established on the western coast of Australia was on high alert. German Marines rushed through the base, loading their magazines and stashing them in their load-bearing equipment. To be frank, they did not know how large the island was or how many people were present. However, since they had encountered hostiles within a 100-kilometer radius, they were not willing to take any chances. Anuria, meanwhile, was rather stoic as she took a puff from her cigarette and blew out the smoke. Melissa was by her side, questioning their next objective. So we landed on the island, established an outpost, and raised the German flag. What else are we supposed to do here? Anuria scoffed at this, responding to her first mate's questions with a hint of disinterest in her voice. Nothing. We're supposed to wait until a proper supply line is established from here to Singapore. Once that's set up, the German military will invest heavily in taking control of the island. As for us, we will move on to the islands to the north and repeat what we've just done. Right now, Berenger is concerned that the Japanese will invade these lands and take them for themselves.
Thus, Berengar wants to establish control over the entire region before Japan can claim a presence here. I don't know his whole strategy, but from what I can tell, he intends to establish small military outposts throughout the region and use his power to coerce his allies into recognizing his claims over the entire archipelago. Then, if Japan tries to settle any island with a German outpost, he can use international pressure to remove them. I feel sorry for Itami. I doubt she can match my man, who is an expert in many things, including geopolitics. Anyway, it will probably be another week before we set sail for our next destination. In the meantime, you can tell the girls to go on regular patrols. The Marines are already stretched thin. We need to do something to help. Once we maintain a direct supply line, this base will become a permanent part of German soil, and we will move on to the next location. Melissa listened to every word her captain spoke and noted all the small details. After thoroughly comprehending everything, she nodded, saluted Honoria, and left. Aye, Captain. After saying this, Melissa went to dispatch the orders to the rest of the crew. Meanwhile, Honoria sat on the shore, drinking coffee in silence. Honoria was not the only one sitting quietly on the battlefield, waiting for supply lines to catch up. Emperor Asha of the Bengal Empire sat within a large stone fortress, established by the Pandya dynasty centuries ago. He and his army had recently moved into the southernmost region of the Indian subcontinent and made great progress in their conquests. However, after extending his forces too far, Asha realized his army was running low on munitions, far beyond his supply lines. Thus, he sat back and waited for the logistic units to catch up, without any worry of being ambushed. Ambushed? That was laughable, considering how many war elements had Gatling guns mounted on their backs. However, as he waited in the stone fortress, one of the Japanese advisors attached to the Bengal army came forward and spoke of his worries. This campaign is taking too long. The Germans took over the Anangpur Empire in a single day. Since then, they have been doing their best to equip and train the Anangpur army to a standard that rivals yours. If we do not make swifter progress, by the time our armies reach the borders of the Anangpur Empire, they could pose a threat to your ambitions. Asha frowned as he heard these words, gazing into the dense jungles of southern India. There was a stern look on his face as he turned around and stared deeply into the Japanese advisor's eyes. Do you truly believe that we can advance into the jungles without supplies and overcome our enemies who lie in wait for us? The Pandya dynasty may be equipped with obsolete firearms, but those weapons are still deadly. I know what your Empress thinks of me, but I am not the fool she believes me to be. If I march into the jungle without a constant supply of resources, my soldiers will run out of food, water, and, most importantly, ammunition. We will be forced to use our bayonets. Meanwhile, the enemy will have the advantage, as they will have access to firearms, primitive though they may be. They can use crude black powder and a small rock to punch through our armor at close distances. They do not need primers for their weapons to function. That is their advantage. Since I cannot manufacture my own ammunition, I must wait for supplies to arrive from your homeland to continue the fight. Something your Empress should be entirely aware of. Do not fret. Within the hour, the latest batch of supplies should be reaching this outpost. Though the Japanese advisor wanted to press Asha into advancing, he understood the Bengal emperor's words to be true. Thus, just as he was about to capitulate, a bell rang in the distance, signaling an enemy's approach. The Pandya dynasty had raised an army and equipped its soldiers with black powder muzzle loaders. Normally, this would not be a problem for the Bengal army, but they had to conserve their ammunition. In the entire stronghold, they had less than 3,000 rounds to fire. The Pandya forces, on the other hand, had well over 10,000 men gathered. Asha immediately cursed in his native tongue when he saw this and quickly gave the order to attack. Make sure those fucking cannons don't make it within firing distance. I want you motherfuckers to shoot anyone who tries to move them closer. With this order given, gunshots echoed in the air, and the men wheeling the cannons forward were blasted in the chest. Their lives were lost without even seeing who had claimed them. However, whenever a body dropped, another man would take his place and push the cannons forward as a team. The Pandya troops did not fire on the stronghold, instead, they advanced further, wanting to conserve their shots for closer range to ensure maximum accuracy.
As they marched forward toward the stronghold where the Bengal army was holed up, the soldiers hiding behind the ramparts fired their shots into the dense formation of Pandya soldiers. With each shot fired, a body fell, but the men were lacking in munitions, so they tried to make every shot count. Every time a Bengal soldier missed his target, he would grit his teeth in frustration before racking the lever and firing another shot downrange. Eventually, the muzzle-loading cannons reached firing distance, and the artillery crews fired a barrage of cannonballs that struck the ancient forces, turning their stone walls to ruin.
Asha nearly bit his tongue in rage when he realized he did not have enough munitions to hold off the enemy.
Consequently, he gave another order to his troops: protect the gates.
Fix bayonets and protect the gates.
As the Bengal soldiers continued to expend what little ammunition they had, the Pandya troops marched forward through the gunfire without regard for their own well-being. Their strategy was to bleed the Bengal forces dry of supplies before breaking down the gates and engaging in an all-out melee. If they could cut the head off the Bengal snake, the body would die with it, or so they believed. However, as cannonballs rained down upon the stone fortress, the sound of an elephant's roar filled the air, causing all men on the battlefield to look to the east, where the supply caravan came into sight. Upon seeing the enemy army laying siege to the fortress, the war elephants, which protected the supply lines, aimed their Gatling guns at the large force and began indiscriminately spraying lead.
Within a minute, hundreds of Pandya soldiers fell to the ground, their lives rapidly fleeing their bodies.
In the end, the battle was won in Asha's favor, and the Bengal army received their supplies. With a smug grin, the Bengal emperor approached the Japanese advisor and spoke with a haughty tone: "Now we can advance further inland." The Ming emperor sat on his throne, reading a letter in his hand. The contents were so unsettling that he was forced to close his eyes and take deep breaths to calm his nerves. Before sending his young son, Zhu Li, to the German embassy, he had sternly reprimanded him for disgracing himself in Japan. The emperor had truly believed his words would humble the young man, who was always misbehaving.
However, the letter from the German embassy was not a friendly communication. In fact, it detailed Gerhard's grievances with the ambassador chosen to represent the Ming dynasty.
Emperor Zhu Wudi, known in this world as the Xuande Emperor, was a wise man who understood the vast disparities in strength between his empire and Germany.
Based on his eldest son's accounts, it seemed Germany might be a nation far more advanced than even the Japanese Empire. If true, this only made the emperor pity Empress Itami while feeling profound fear toward the Germans. He did not believe for a moment that their Kaiser had no ambitions beyond trade with the Far East. Challenging Berenger von Kufstein, however, was practically suicide, as every man who had ever threatened the Kaiser was now dead. Zhu Wudi knew all too well the capabilities required to rise from the lowest ranks of nobility to become an emperor who dominated his neighbors. It was an achievement few in history could claim. After taking a few deep breaths, the Ming emperor called to his nearest servant and said 4 simple words: "Fetch me my son." Even though Zhu Wudi had many sons, the servant instinctively knew whom he meant.
For there was only one of the Ming emperor's children who had caused the man to speak in such a heavy tone. A few moments passed, and eventually, Zhu Li strode proudly into the great hall of the Forbidden Palace, where he bowed before his royal father with a wide smirk on his face. "Father, I have done as you asked and spoken to the German embassy." The servant was about to leave the room when the Ming emperor called out to him, "Stay." After saying this, Zhu Wudi rose from his throne and pulled out a nearby bottle of whiskey imported from the Reich. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to his proud son without a word. Zhu Li quickly took a drink, but before he could swallow its contents, his father reached out and punched him in the gut, sending him to his knees where he vomited the alcoholic beverage onto the floor. After doing this, Zhu Wudi threw a towel toward his son and gave him a simple command: "Clean it up." Zhu Li did as he was instructed, but he felt aggrieved and was about to protest his treatment when his father spoke to him in a stern tone. "You fucked up." The Ming prince clearly did not understand his father's words and quickly protested. "What do you mean? I did as you asked. I spoke to the German embassy and got their support." Upon hearing this, the Ming emperor kicked his son in the face, sending him to the floor, where his head landed in the pool of vomited whiskey. "You did what I asked? Really? Answer me this, you little cocksucker. Did I tell you to insult the German ambassador? Did I give you instructions to threaten the man in his own home?"
Ha? In what way did you do as I asked? A pitiful expression was on Zhu Li's face. He was greatly enraged and confused by his father's words, causing him to speak out against him. No, but that barbarian disrespected me. Before he could finish, his father glared at him with a murderous gaze and scolded him for his mistake. That barbarian is the brother-in-law of the Kaiser. Do you understand what that means? It means the Kaiser sees diplomatic relations with our realm as a matter of supreme importance. Yet, in your infinite wisdom, you didn't just insult the man, you fucking threatened him. The fact that you threatened a member of the Kaiser's family means you threatened Berenger von Kufstein himself. I can't save you. In fact, I don't even want to try. The Germans will come for you now. There is no place on this planet, not even my palace, that can grant you a safe haven. So get out of my sight before you drag me down with you. Zhu Li gazed in horror at his father's words, but even more so at his father's reaction. The mighty Ming Emperor was trembling, not out of rage, but from a deep sense of fear. Despite the Emperor's cruel words, the Ming prince could not accept what he had done or comprehend just how dire his situation was. In the end, he could only speak two simple words: "Father, please." However, the Ming Emperor rebuked him again and ordered the guards to escort him out of the palace. You are no son of mine. Guards, take this dead man out of my home and cast him into the streets. If he dares show his face again, kill him on the spot. Zhu Li continued to scream, but it was no use. The royal guards of the Ming Emperor were too much for him to handle. They lifted him into the air and threw him into the mud outside the palace gates before closing them, locking the Ming prince out of his own home. Rain poured from the sky as Zhu Li continued to lie in the mud, contemplating what he had done to deserve such a fate. After nearly 30 minutes, he rose to his feet and began to walk the streets of Beijing like a zombie. Though he did not know it, he soon found himself in the market, where a beautiful young German woman approached him with a map in her hands. It was clear that her Mandarin was not the best, and yet she politely asked the man a question. Excuse me? Can you tell me how to get to the palace district? It was not these words that pulled the Ming prince out of his feud-like state, but the pushed dagger that pierced his heart moments after they were spoken. Zhu Li gazed in astonishment at the pretty blonde woman, who had a stoic expression on her face as she withdrew her blade and walked away, blending into the endless crowds. Zhu Li could only gaze in astonishment at the blood that soaked his muddy robes before falling to his knees helplessly. Within an hour after he had been expelled from his home, the Kaiser's assassins had struck, leaving the once proud prince of the Ming dynasty dying alone in a pool of his own blood. However, by the time the crowds realized that the man had died in the streets, it was too late. The female assassin had long since escaped from the scene of her crime, leaving the Ming prince as nothing more than a corpse in the streets of Beijing. As for the Ming Emperor, he sat back on his throne and gazed at the letter in his hands, tears streaming down his face, before burning it over the flame of a candle. As the flames devoured the paper, the last words to remain visible were the following: Only death awaits those who have threatened the Kaiser and his family. The sentence is already clear and grammatically correct. No changes are needed. News of Zhu Li's death spread across Asia quickly. The death of a Ming prince was no small matter, and soon everyone knew that the man had been killed in the streets. Though the identity of the assassin remained unknown, neither the German embassy nor the Ming Emperor spoke about the incident after it occurred. What was done, and there was no turning back. While the Ming Emperor mourned his errant son, he did not blame the Reich for their actions. He knew that, if given the same circumstances, he would have reacted similarly. Because no hostilities emerged between the two powers, business continued to boom between the Reich and the Ming dynasty. Goods flowed from west to east, and vice versa, creating a new Silk Road, one that was traversed by sea. With the might of the German Navy protecting international trade, there was not the slightest risk in sailing from East Asia to Europe. Both the German and Ming empires prospered during this time of peace. Though both Berenger and Wu Di knew that these days would not last forever, they did their best to make the most of the peace while it still lasted. While Berenger used this time to advance his society at a rapid pace, Itami had other plans in mind. The war for the Philippines continued, and a month went by without issue. In the end, the island of Mindanao was conquered within this short time frame. The land was fully annexed by Empress Itami,
and she immediately began construction of oil wells and refinement facilities. This, combined with the fact that Japan had already constructed its first power plant, meant that the Japanese Empire would soon enter the era of mechanized warfare. However, for the time being, they still had many hurdles to overcome before they could truly manufacture armored vehicles. Meanwhile, in Australia, Anuria found herself increasingly isolated from her crew. They had yet to begin their island-hopping campaign as they awaited the supply lines to catch up to the new colony. It was during this time that the pirate queen realized she no longer found joy in exploration. Since Anuria and her crew made first contact with the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, conflict was a regular part of life within the small outpost. Patrols were regularly ambushed, and though the German Marines and privateers were equipped with modern weapons, that did not make them invincible. After suffering their first casualty, the German Marines responded with a series of punitive raids, attacking Aboriginal villages without mercy. The only reason the conflict did not spread further inland was the lack of resources among the German Marines for a proper campaign. While the Marines conducted their raids, Anuria's crew took on support roles, doing everything they could to pass the time before setting out on their next adventure. During this time, Anuria spent nearly every waking hour on the beach, staring off into the distance as she drank her rum. Perhaps it was her age, but she no longer found joy in exploring, privateering, or fighting with natives. In fact, the whole endeavor seemed rather silly when she considered the advanced German military. Was there a true need for privateers like herself in this day and age? In the past, Berenger had legalized privateering due to the lack of ships in the German Navy to effectively fight their enemies. Though Anuria's crew was the most famous of these sea dogs, they were not the only ones out there. However, with advancements in the German Navy and the overwhelming reach of the Reich, privateering was dying out, and with good reason. Currently, Anuria was in a state of contemplation, reflecting on her place in life. Out of the entire crew, she only recognized Elfron and Melissa. Melissa was often busy overseeing the more critical tasks required of her, while Elfron spent most of her free time fraternizing with the new recruits. As for the rest of the crew, they were a bunch of wide-eyed 18-year-old girls who looked up to Anuria as if she were a living legend, but they also viewed their mighty captain as a relic of the ancient past. Anuria merely sipped her drink, sighed in depression, and muttered her thoughts aloud. Perhaps I really am too old to be sailing around the world with a bunch of young women. At this moment, as she reflected on why she had even bothered to come on this journey, Elfron approached her. The woman held a bottle of rum in one hand and had the other firmly around the waist of one of her girls. When Elfron saw the depressed expression on Anuria's face, she couldn't help but speak up. "Captain, is everything all right?" Anuria looked over and saw the girl she had once saved from a life of slavery. Only now, she was no longer a young and defenseless girl but a fully grown woman who knew how to take charge and kick ass. Perhaps this was the final nail in the coffin, but upon seeing such a drastic change, Anuria couldn't help but sigh and express her true thoughts. "I want to go home." Elfron was taken aback by these words. In all her years of pirating and exploring, she had always seen Anuria as the most adventurous spirit she had ever laid eyes on. Currently, the crew was exploring uncharted lands and conquering them for their homeland. Yet, there was no sense of wonder in Anuria's mint green eyes, only a deep longing for her family. If she was being honest, Elfron had never seen Anuria in such a homesick state. In the past, the Byzantine princess would always complain about having to go home when the voyage was nearing its end. Yet, after only a few months, the woman was already ready to call it quits. This behavior was common among new recruits but definitely not something the captain should express. Before Elfron could even try to convince Anuria to cheer up, the woman spoke with a stern tone. "When the ships arrive, I will be sailing back to Singapore. For the first time in my life, I think I have had enough of fleeing from my responsibilities. I should have put an end to this youthful indiscretion of mine a long time ago. Elfron, the ship and the crew are yours to command. You can do with them as you please. Just remember that you fly the colors of the Reich and should do nothing that would bring dishonor to your homeland or your Kaiser. I think it is about time I return home." Elfron always knew this day would come, but she did not expect Anuria to call it quits before they even reached the halfway point of their journey. Struggling to find the words to respond to this decree, tears formed in Elfron's eyes as she gritted her teeth and lashed out emotionally.
It's that bastard's fault, isn't it? Every chance you get, you abandon us and run back to his arms. Did you know that out of the original members of our crew, half of them are dead? They died for you. Most met their deaths in the Andes, but others passed away on voyages where you weren't even present. The rest of those girls retired with enough gold to live in luxury for the rest of their lives. There are only 3 of us left, and I know for a fact that once you go, Melissa will follow. After everything I have done for you, are you just going to give up halfway through your retirement journey? Do I mean nothing to you? Honoria had always known that Elfrun had strong feelings for her, but she chose to ignore them rather than break the girl's heart. Today, however, it seemed the landmine she had been avoiding had finally been stepped on. Taking a deep breath, Honoria responded coldly to Elfrun's statements. I have a family waiting for me back home, one I have neglected for too long. Over the years, I have tried my best to mend the rift between us, but they always feared I would go on another journey and get myself killed. Because of this, they still treat me as if I am a stranger. I have come here, an entire world away from my home, sitting in the burning sun, and for what? One last chance at a youthful hurrah? I should have known better. I should have rejected Berenger's kind offer. I will always be thankful for what you and all the girls have done for me. I will also always mourn those who have passed away in pursuit of fame, fortune, and adventure. Lord knows I have done everything I can to compensate their loved ones for their loss. However, Elfrun, since the day I first took you in, I made it clear that my heart belongs to Berenger. You will always be my most precious friend, but nothing more. I gift you this crew and this vessel because I know you can still do many great things for the Reich. You can lead these girls on the adventures we all shared in the past, perhaps even more exciting ones now that you don't need to fear death as we once did. However, you will have to do these things without me. After saying this, Honoria did not wait for a response. She merely hugged Elfrun as the girl cried in her arms. The 2 of them would not speak again until the day the supply ships arrived, and Honoria set sail for Singapore. From there, she would take the first flight back to the Reich. As for the crew of the Queen Honoria's Revenge, they still had a role to play in Berenger's expansion. He would not forsake them, even though his wife was no longer their captain. For now, they would continue their voyages across Australasia, claiming all the land they could for the German Empire. Weeks passed, and the long-awaited supply ships arrived in Australia, bringing with them a significant number of men to begin constructing a proper military base. Honoria said her goodbyes to her crew before departing with Melissa back to Singapore. The farewell wasn't overly emotional, as Honoria had already spoken everything that needed to be said to Elfrun. As for the rest of the crew, she barely knew half their names. The 2 women flew together back to Kufstein, where they shared one last conversation before parting ways. Honoria struggled to fight back the tears as she gazed fondly at her old first mate. It was difficult for her to find her voice, but she finally asked the question she was most curious about. So, where will you go now? Melissa was equally emotional as she sighed heavily and gazed off to the west. After several moments of silence, she revealed her plans. I think I'll buy a ticket to New Haven. The city is a den of vice and gambling, prostitution, drugs, alcohol, and plenty of it. It sounds like my kind of place. I might use my fortune to open a casino and a few brothels. I know the business well, and for many foreign girls, it's a better option than staying in their homelands. I'll treat them right and maybe even reinvent the game. What about you, Honoria? I suppose I already know the answer, but what will you do now that you've retired from the pirate's life? Honoria scoffed, wiping the tears from her eyes before responding. What else can I do? Get down on my knees and beg my children for forgiveness. The looks in their eyes when they saw me going on my last journey were truly gut-wrenching. I owe it to my kids to be the mother I should have been all those years ago. I wish you the best of luck, Melissa, and hope that one day we may meet again. Melissa said nothing and merely nodded her head. The 2 women exchanged a brief hug before parting ways. It was unknown whether they would see each other again in this life. But Melissa could sigh in relief, knowing that Honoria was no longer the naive girl who had recklessly run away from home all those years ago. Honoria had not informed Berenger that she would be returning home so soon. But nothing within the Reich escaped Linda's ears, even in a distant colony like Singapore. Because of this, a car was waiting for Honoria at the airbase, which quickly brought her back to the palace. The moment she stepped out of the vehicle, she saw her 3 children waiting for her, along with her husband and Linda. Alexandros and Helena gazed upon their biological mother with complex emotions in their hearts. They had honestly never expected the woman to quit halfway through her retirement voyage and come home. As for Constantinus, he was merely an infant and was held in Linda's arms as if he were her own child, a sight that was all too common among Honoria's children. Berenger approached Honoria, who had a long expression on her face, and hugged her before whispering into her ear the words she wanted to hear the most. Welcome home. Home. This was where she was meant to be all along. It suddenly seemed so preposterous that she had spent so many years running away from this place when it was the source of all her greatest memories. Honoria nodded her head and repeated the words as if in a trance. Home. Yes, I am finally home. Linda had a complicated expression on her face. Honoria and she shared a special bond, one that was second only to the one they both had with their husband. She could tell Honoria had a difficult time accepting her retirement. Even Linda was surprised when she heard that Honoria had boarded the supply ship and abandoned her crew. While Linda was reflecting on this, Berenger and Honoria continued to embrace each other for several moments before the man let go of his wife. After doing so, he smiled and grabbed her luggage, preparing to bring it inside their home. With a wry smile, he mentioned what he and their kids had been up to during her absence. I promised the kids we would go out to eat as a family when you finally returned. I honestly didn't expect it to be so soon. However, I know what the flight from Singapore does to a person, so I will let you rest for a few days before we have our family outing. Honoria was honestly surprised to hear this. She looked over at her 2 oldest children with a hint of suspicion before asking her husband, the kids agreed to this? Berenger smiled, but before he could respond, Helena spoke up on his behalf. Alexandros and I have both agreed to give you a second chance at being our mother, something we would have never done before you retired from your life of piracy. These words broke a barrier within Honoria's mind that she had erected to prevent herself from succumbing to the tears that were ever present in the back of her eyes. The moment she heard her kids say they were giving her a second chance, she fell to her knees and cried. The sight was so startling that both of her children rushed forward to help the woman, as did Linda and Berenger. When Alexandros and Helena approached, Honoria wrapped her arms around them, struggling to say the following words between sobs. Thank you. I promise to do everything I can to make up for all those years. Alexandros and Helena were still young, and they did not have the mental fortitude to remain calm in such a situation. It only took one of them to begin crying before the other followed. Surprisingly, it was the older sibling, Alexandros, who broke down first. Linda smiled at the scene. Though the mother and her 2 children were crying, the red-headed beauty knew this was a good sign. It was the start of a new, healthier relationship between Honoria and her children. Even Berenger was nearly moved to tears. However, he was a man and had resolved never to cry, especially not in public. Perhaps, at 3 in the morning, he might take a smoke break and cry alone on the patio. But at this moment, he was as firm as a rock, even as everyone else was moved to tears. The lack of emotion on his face actually caused Linda to become a bit enraged. She balled her fists and lightly pounded Berenger on the chest as he gazed coldly at the scene. How can you not be crying at a time like this? Are you really that much of an unfeeling asshole? Berenger did not scoff. There was no disdain or anger on his face about the sudden assault. Instead, he gazed upon his beloved wife with a pitiful expression before revealing his thoughts to the woman he loved. I do not have the luxury to cry. Linda heard Berenger's words and didn't understand them at first. However, as she looked around, she realized they were still within the driveway of the imperial palace. When she realized they were in public and behaving so shamefully, the woman sniffled for several seconds and fought back the tears before nodding her head 3 times. After doing so, she hugged her man and whispered in his ear, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Berenger merely nodded before responding to her apology. I know. With that, Berenger allowed his 3rd wife and their 2 children to cry out all their emotions. Afterward, he led them inside and hosted a special retirement meal for Honoria. Every member of his family was present, and he made sure to shower Honoria with the love she needed during this painful transition in her life. As for the family outing he had promised, that would happen on the weekend. Itami sat in her personal quarters, filling out paperwork. If there was one thing that never changed in her daily life, it was this. She often considered jumping out her window and fleeing the palace whenever a new stack of papers appeared on her desk. While the young empress signed each document, another person was present in the room. This was Nakamura Hana, the young woman Itami had chosen to lead her Kempitai, or intelligence agency. Hana had come to inform the empress of some important matters that required attention. As you are probably already aware, Prince Julie has recently passed away. After a thorough investigation, we have concluded the cause of his untimely death. It appears that, after damaging the relationship between the Ming dynasty and the German Empire, Prince Julie was disowned by his father and cast out onto the streets. The pampered fool somehow ended up in the black market, where he was stabbed and robbed, ultimately leading to his death. Tenno Hikasama, I understand that your relationship with the deceased prince soured during his last visit, but I believe it would be appropriate to send a gift to the Ming Emperor to express our condolences. Though the fool was disowned, he was still Zhu Wudi's son. Itami put down her pen and shifted her gaze toward her intelligence director. She immediately noticed the portrait of Berenger, which hung on the wall directly behind the woman. As Itami stared at Berenger's smug smile, a thought crossed her mind, and she voiced it aloud. Is it possible the Germans had something to do with the prince's death? Nakamura immediately shook her head and dismissed this claim entirely. From her investigation, there was no evidence to support the idea that German intelligence had played a role in the foolish prince's assassination. That is entirely unlikely. It is far more probable that the spoiled prince angered a local gangster and got himself stabbed. Though the German Empire is a force to be reckoned with, even they treat the Ming dynasty with respect. There would have to be a good reason for the Kaiser to dispatch his assassins to deal with someone like the errant prince. Itami nodded inside before picking up her pen and getting back to her paperwork. As she did so, she expressed her irritation at being interrupted. I guess I'm just being paranoid. Still, I can't help but feel like that bastard got the best of me yet again. Anyway, I doubt you interrupted my work solely to talk about that idiot's death? Did you really need my permission just to send a gift to the Ming Emperor? Tell me, why are you really here? Nakamura hesitated for a few moments before speaking her mind. The look in her eyes made it clear that she did not want to say what she had to say. But in the end, she spoke, knowing that ignoring such a thing would only invite future disaster. While it is true that this is old news, it is in fact related to my primary reason for visiting. It appears that the Kaiser has gifted a rather modern warship to the Ming Emperor as an act of condolence for Zhu Li's recent passing. Itami was in the middle of signing her name on yet another document when she heard these words. She was so shocked by this news that her hand slipped and ruined her signature. However, she paid this no mind and instead glared at Nakamura with an intimidating gaze before interrogating her about the nature of this warship. Just how modern are we talking here? Nakamura shifted her eyes away from the enraged Empress, unwilling to meet her chilling gaze. She spoke in a meek voice, revealing news she knew Itami would find displeasing. It appears to be a direct copy of our latest cruiser's design. A loud bang echoed as Itami slammed her fist onto her wooden table, accompanied by the sounds of her deep breathing. The young Japanese empress was clearly enraged and in a state of panic as she tried to think through how this was possible. Voicing her thoughts aloud, she said, "How is this possible? Have our designs been leaked? No, the Germans have no agents on the Japanese mainland. Wait a second. Oh, those fucking traitors." It was clear from her last words that Itami had realized how the Germans had obtained her blueprints. During her purges of the old guard, many Japanese citizens had fled to the Ming dynasty. Not long after, Germany announced it would be taking in these refugees. Clearly, someone important had fled her country without her noticing and brought with them the designs they had helped create. Itami had no way of knowing that German agents were indeed conducting espionage on Japanese soil, disguised as Koreans and Japanese turncoats. This made it difficult for even her secret police to detect their activities. Germany had used the knowledge gained from these refugees to contact Japanese smugglers, allowing them to infiltrate the Japanese mainland undetected.
The most alarming aspect for Empress Itami Ryo and her Kempeitai was that the Germans had built a cruiser from scratch using her own designs, constructing an entire warship faster than she herself could produce such a vessel. Right now, her navy was almost entirely reliant on destroyers and submarines. Larger warships were still under construction. Her shipyards depended on semi-skilled workers who had undergone a crash course in building steel-hulled warships. It would not be an understatement to say that the Japanese-style cruiser created by the Germans was a superior product to those currently under construction in Japan. This information aggravated Itami for several reasons. Firstly, it was only recently that the Japanese Empire had been able to apply pressure to the Ming dynasty.
Berenger's bold move of supplying the Ming with armored frigates had forced Itami to take a step back in international diplomacy.
However, after constructing a sizable fleet of destroyers and submarines, Itami was once more able to pressure the Ming into giving her more favorable trade deals. Unfortunately, now that a modern cruiser existed within the Ming's fleet of warships, she was forced to re-evaluate her diplomatic methods. Though she had no doubt her current military strength was enough to obliterate the Ming fleet, any military action would be costly to her own navy, and she needed to save her strength for the eventual war with the German Empire. At the very least, the Ming now had the confidence to reject her requests.
The second reason for Itami's concern was the discrepancy in manufacturing ability between her nation and the Reich.
She had invested substantial time and effort into designing these cruisers, and yet, before she could even field one of these vessels, her rival on the other side of the world had obtained her blueprints and manufactured a superior product based on her designs. The speed at which the German shipyards could manufacture warships was leagues ahead of her own, even if their designs were outdated compared to her own vessels. This meant that by the time they finally engaged in war, the Germans would have many more vessels than she had, and quantity was its own form of strength, especially at sea. Finally, the last reason this news irritated Itami was one of personal pride. She could not believe that, after all her efforts over the past few months, which were spent building a powerful navy, Berenger had bested her once again.
The thought was utterly infuriating.
After reflecting on this in a matter of seconds, Itami glared fiercely at her intelligence director and said two simple words.
"Get out." Upon realizing just how enraged the Empress had become, Nakamura bowed respectfully before fleeing Itami's personal quarters.
Once alone, Itami fell back onto her bed and stared up at the ceiling, utterly depressed by her most recent defeat. It took several moments for her gaze to shift toward her body pillow, but once it did, she felt a bit better. The albino beauty wrapped her arms around the pillow and brought it into her embrace, speaking to it as if it were her lover.
"Oh Julian, what am I going to do about this?" Naturally, silence prevailed.
However, Itami could practically hear Julian's voice in her head, giving her advice on how to handle the situation.
Ultimately, she concluded that she needed to focus more on naval output.
If Itami had any hope of competing with the Reich on the seas, she would need to have men working around the clock on building warships. Luckily, she had just invented electricity, and soon the cities would have light, even in the dark of night. Of course, she knew that putting her workers on graveyard shifts would cause further dissent. However, she did not have the luxury to worry about her people's well-being.
Not with such a monumental threat on the horizon.
Korigin sat on her horse, gazing at her elder brother with a stoic expression on her pretty face. For the past few months, the Golden Horde had been bogged down in the mountains of Georgia, fighting a series of protracted sieges. It had become increasingly clear to her that they would not be able to defeat both Georgia and the Byzantine Empire within a year's time. As a result, she had begun to counsel her brother on a new strategy.
"My dearest brother, the spirits advise us to move on from Georgia and focus our efforts on Anatolia.
The western half of the Kingdom of Georgia has dug in, fighting to the last man. There is no surrender, no retreat.
If we continue to assault this petty kingdom, we will not reach Constantinople in time." Shagadai nodded in understanding, gazing upon the vast wasteland that was their most recent conquest.
He had lost thousands of men to take one simple city. It was becoming increasingly clear that his little sister's words were true, and he felt compelled to agree with her approach.
"Very well. If that is the advice of the spirits, Who am I to reject such wisdom? I will gather our troops and abandon what remains of this petty kingdom. It's not as though they have the means to reclaim the land we have already conquered." After saying this, Shagadai snapped the reins of his horse and rode off to rally his troops and give them their new orders. Corrigan, meanwhile, sat on her horse and gazed up at the sky as the wind caressed her regal face. She could hear the spirits speaking to her, issuing their warnings once more. "Beware the eagle in the west. In 6 months' time, it will spread forth its wings and bring ruin to your people." Time was passing quickly, yet it felt incredibly slow. Corrigan was on edge with every moment. The more the spirits spoke to her, the more uneasy she felt about her people's fate. Though her brother had promised a quick conquest, the mountains of Georgia and the castles where the people dwelled presented more challenges than expected. Now she only had 6 months left before the eagle spread its wings and brought ruin to her people. It was a warning she had heard too many times to count, and with each passing month, the time grew shorter. Eventually, Shagadai returned to his sister's side with a wide grin and nudged her forward. "The army has been gathered. The orders are given. We ride to Anatolia." Though Shagadai expected some form of happiness to appear on his precious little sister's face, all he saw was deep-seated anxiety, as if she had already foreseen their defeat before they had even begun their conquest of the Byzantine Empire. The Mongol princess seemed in a trance, paying no attention to her brother's words. Instead, she repeated what she had heard from the spirits: "Wings of iron will bring forth volcanic rain." What does it mean? She could never have guessed that the Germans had mastered the skies and were capable of dropping bombs on her brother's army without ever coming within range of the Golden Horde's weapons. Not knowing what an airplane was or the power of a modern bomb, she could not comprehend the warning the spirits were giving her. Shagadai was stunned into silence. For once, his sister was listening to the spirits but could not understand their meaning. It was not uncommon for the woman to enter a trance-like state whenever she tried to comprehend the meaning behind the parables the spirits spoke to her. However, she always deciphered their meaning correctly and rather swiftly. Yet, this message had completely stumped her. No matter how much she tried, she could not figure out what these words meant. Because of this lack of understanding, a deep sense of fear appeared in her black eyes. Only after composing herself did she plead with her brother once more. Panic was evident on the young woman's face as she grabbed hold of her brother's sleeve and held onto it tightly. "Dearest brother, I implore you once more to move your armies north and abandon your dreams of conquering the south. I fear the fate that awaits us in Constantinople is unimaginable. For the first time in my life, I can't decipher the spirit's meaning. Please, brother, I beg you." Shagadai was utterly speechless. His sister had, on more than one occasion, implored him to march his army north. However, she had not done so in some time, as if she had accepted her fate. Whatever the spirits had told her now thoroughly spooked the girl. She was practically shaking as she stared deeply into her brother's eyes. However, no matter how fearful Corrigan might be, Shagadai would not be deterred. His goals of conquering the Byzantine and Timurid empires were too great to abandon, especially now that they had made some progress. Thus, he did not attempt to persuade his sister but wore a stern expression as he gave her a direct order. "Enough! I have obeyed the will of the spirits far more than any of my predecessors. Just because you can't decipher the meaning of their words doesn't mean a horrible fate awaits us. The Byzantines are weak, and the Timurids are on their last breath. Now is the time to strike. Now is the time to conquer an empire that will make the entire world fear our might." Corrigan was almost moved to tears as she heard her brother thoroughly rebuke her. She didn't know why he was so stubborn about this, nor did she understand why she was so fearful. Perhaps he was right. The spirits had previously assured her that as long as Constantinople fell within a year, there was nothing to worry about. So, she took a deep breath, found her resolve, and silently nodded her head several times. After a few moments, she released her grip on her brother's sleeve and responded meekly to his commands. "I will do as dearest brother has commanded. We will ride south, and I will bring with me the wisdom of the spirits." Upon hearing this, Shagadai smiled and gently grabbed his sister's dainty chin, reassuring her that everything would be fine. "You don't need to worry so much. I would never let any harm come to my precious little sister. After that, the two noble Mongols sat in silence for several moments before leaving the wasteland and rejoining the main army. However, Korigin couldn't help but look back with intense anxiety in her black eyes, as if this were the last gasp of the Mongol people. Currently, Berengar was sitting in a booth with his wife Honoria by his side, and two of their children seated across from them. Out of all the local eateries in the city of Kufstein, Berengar had chosen what could only be described as a barbecue joint to share a meal with his family and mull over some of their deep-seated issues. Honoria had a pleasant smile on her face as she bit into the ribs and savored their taste. Though it had only been a few days since she returned from her journey to Oceania, she seemed to be taking her retirement rather well. Humans are naturally complicated creatures, and a mere few days was clearly not enough time for the woman to properly process her emotions. Still, that did not get in the way of Honoria spending time with her family. In fact, since her return, she had spent nearly every waking hour with her children or her husband. She had even been rather aggressive in the bedroom, having an intense desire to bear more children. After all, though Honoria had been with Berengar for almost as long as Linda had, she had fallen behind the red-headed vixen in terms of progeny. Thus, Berengar was in a rather pleased mood, as Honoria took advantage of every opportunity to be intimate with him. Though he never lacked the company of women, he did enjoy it when his wives were so eager to please him. While Berengar and Honoria had broad smiles on their faces as they happily ate the barbecue ribs and pulled pork, their children, Alexandros and Helena, were not nearly as pleased. Though they had given their mother a second chance and were pleased to see their efforts were not going to waste, it was not easy to remove the damage of neglect. Ultimately, it was Berengar who broke the silence, deciding to question his young son about what he had been learning lately. "So, Alexandros, why don't you tell your mother about your academics? You and Ghazi should be going through special leadership courses. How have your grades been as of late?" In addition to their regular schoolwork, which Berengar made sure his children were not slacking off in, Alexandros and Ghazi were also being groomed to be the perfect leaders for their mother's homelands. Ghazi was technically already the Sultan of Al-Andalus, but he was too young to actually rule, so his father was the regent. As for Alexandros, though he was not yet officially the heir of the Byzantine emperor, Berengar had laid the groundwork that would lead to Quintus and his wastrel of a little brother being stripped of their rights to succession. In the end, Vetranes would choose Alexandros to succeed him. Berengar was extremely adamant about that. Because of this, the boy had to sit through many courses regarding the administration of a realm, military tactics, the art of diplomacy, and economics. In fact, Alexandros and Ghazi were in a bit of a friendly competition to see who received the best grades. Thus, the boy was quick to brag about his latest scores. "I scored a 98 on my last economics exam. I beat Ghazi by 3 whole points." Berengar smiled and nodded. He had nothing but praise for both of his boys, but he still needed to reward the winner of their little competitions. So, he took a rather playful tone as he addressed this. "Good job. I'll tell you what, just for that, I'll let you order a dessert of your choice. How does that sound?" Alexandros nodded his head with an excited smile. As for Honoria, she was happy to see her boy doing so well and was quick to add something to the conversation. "I didn't expect you to be going over such complicated topics at your age. You must be mommy's little genius." Alexandros forced a smile when he heard his mother's compliment. While he was aware that he was naturally more intelligent than other kids his age, when compared to his eldest brother, Hans, he was by no means an actual genius. But he did not correct his mother. She seemed genuinely happy for him, and he did not want to ruin the moment. However, Helena was not so polite. "What's so great about a 98 on an intro to economics course?" When Hans was his age, he was already studying mechanical engineering. The look in Helena's eyes made it clear that she had great admiration for her eldest half-brother. So much so that she was willing to insult her full-blooded brother and counter her mother's praise. Normally, such a thing would provoke a mother, but she had such a close relationship with Linda that she also considered Hans to be her son. Thus, she only wore a faint smile before replying to her daughter's sharp remarks. "Hans is an exceptionally gifted child. It's unfair to compare anyone else with him. I am even willing to bet that when he finally matures into an adult, his mind will be greater than even his father's."
Berenger was in the middle of drinking a beer when he heard this statement and nearly choked on the liquid. While it was true that Hans was a genius on the level of history's greatest minds, Berenger still did not want to admit that his son would one day be more intelligent than him, let alone hear his wife praise the boy in such a way.
His reaction to Anuria's remark caused the woman and her 2 children to laugh at his expense.
With Helena roasting Berenger on the spot, even Daddy can feel inferior to someone else.
Don't worry, Daddy, you're still the greatest in your daughter's eyes. Even though Hans will one day be smarter than you.
Berenger remained completely silent when he heard his daughter mocking him. He did not have the face to argue with a child about a point he knew to be true. Instead, he merely sighed in defeat, knowing that his son's supreme intellect would be used to advance the Reich beyond what he personally left behind. To Berenger, his legacy meant everything. It was not just about building the world's greatest empire, it had to be stable and survive in all its glory long after he was gone. He did not want to be like Alexander the Great, who worked his entire life to build a mighty empire, only for it to completely collapse after his death. Though Berenger rarely thought about the succession issue, Hans was indeed the most ideal candidate, at least for the time being. He had many children, and the majority of them were still toddlers. It was impossible to know just what great things the offspring of Berenger the Blessed would achieve in their lives. After several moments of being laughed at, Berenger pushed away his pride and admitted the truth in front of his family, something they never thought he would do.
So what if Hans will be more intelligent than me? That just means I can rest easy in the afterlife, knowing the Reich will be in good hands. Besides, it's not just Hans.
I foresee a future where all of my children are extreme talents in whatever fields they choose to pursue. A golden generation of the von Kufstein dynasty who will work together to keep my dream alive.
I feel no shame in admitting this, rather, I have a deep sense of pride.
Helena pouted when she heard her father boast about his kids in such a haughty manner. Her next words were like a bucket of ice water dropped on Berenger's head.
Daddy is really shameless, isn't he?
This critical strike pierced through Berenger's heart and made him sigh in depression. The look on his face was enough to make Anuria break out into a fit of giggles. She could not believe her little girl had spoken so ruthlessly to her father. It was absolutely adorable to the woman who was once known as the Pirate Queen. However, after seeing Berenger sulk like a kid who had just been robbed of his lunch money, Anuria wrapped her arms around the man's shoulder and comforted him. Daddy truly is shameless, but that's one reason why I love him so much.
This was the first time Helena and Alexandros had heard their mother call their father Daddy.
It was usually a pet name the woman reserved for the man in private. However, she had instinctively used the term after hearing her daughter call him such a name. Despite being so ruthlessly burned by his daughter, Berenger could only chuckle and take it in stride. After all, the kids seemed to be warming up to their mother, which was a good thing. The entire meal was about getting together and hashing things out, and it appeared to have a good start.
The rest of the meal was shared with light-hearted conversation and an overall enjoyable experience for Berenger and his family. When the group finished, they returned home.
Anuria tucked her kids into bed before spending the night with her man. Though tonight's venture seemed minor, it was a big deal to Alexandros and Helena. For the first time, they felt they had a mother who wouldn't leave them behind. It was an average spring day in the city of Kufstein. The air was warm, and people were going about their daily lives. However, outside the city limits, a new attraction had gathered crowds. This attraction was none other than the Kufstein Zoo. Since acquiring the leopard Genseric, Berenger had gone out of his way to pay trappers around the globe to capture magnificent beasts not found in the fatherland. After substantial effort and funding, he had gathered enough animals to fill an entire zoo. On this particular Saturday, Berenger was standing among the crowds with his large family. He had taken the day off to escort his loved ones to the newly opened zoo. Naturally, he paid for all their tickets before walking into the establishment with a wide smile on his face. Berenger had a total of 17 legitimate children from 5 different women. 2 of his sons were engaged, meaning there were more people in the Kaiser's group than just his immediate family. Upon entering the zoo, the various children of the Kaiser had excited smiles as they took in the many sights. Berenger already had an exhibit in mind that he wanted to show his kids first. He pointed at the map in his hand and addressed his family.
We're going to check out the leopard exhibit first. Then we'll make our way around the big cat section before heading to the wolf exhibit. Linda, who was pushing a stroller with her youngest children, had a warm smile and nodded in agreement. It sounds like a plan to me. The other women nodded silently. For dates like this, they usually followed whatever their man had planned. Thus, the large group made their way to the leopard exhibit, where they witnessed Genseric, along with several females of various leopard subspecies, lazing about in their enclosed area. Genseric roared loudly when he saw his former master, quickly jumping up onto the edges of the enclosed space, or his head pressed against the cage. The sight scared most of the people in the crowd, as the only thing separating them from this magnificent predator was a thin layer of steel fencing. The exhibit was large, in fact, all of them were. Compared to the zoos in Berenger's past, the Kufstein Zoo was several times larger, with each beast given a proper living space to run around and enjoy. The leopard exhibit was no exception. Though many in the crowd were initially frightened by Genseric's actions, the next moment, the leopard simply rolled onto the ground and exposed its belly to its former master, as if it were a mere house cat. Berenger gazed upon the big cat with a complicated expression. In years past, he had raised this leopard as his personal pet. Genseric was also the son of a deity's familiar and, because of this, had a superior intellect compared to other members of its species. However, Genseric was raised around Berenger's family, making him an incredibly social creature. The leopard seemed genuinely happy to see its former master visit. After all, Berenger's schedule was busy, and he did not often have the time to visit his old pet. After gazing at the 5 female leopards and the many cubs they had spawned together, Berenger knew his decision to send the beast to the zoo was correct. Thus, he smiled as he pet Genseric and gave the creature a command. "Go on, get back to your family. You're startling the crowd." Genseric responded by licking Berenger's fingers before obeying the command. The entire sequence had thoroughly shocked the crowd, who were completely unfamiliar with the fact that this mighty beast had once been the Kaiser's pet. As a result, rumors began to spread about Berenger's superhuman connection to animals and his ability to tame them quickly. After seeing the large cat, many of Berenger's children cried out in joy, as they were well accustomed to the mighty leopard and had missed him since he left the palace. Overall, it was a pleasant experience for the family, who stayed to watch the beast as it made its children and mates line up in front of the royal family, as if giving them a proper salute. Those in the crowd who had portable cameras took photos of the event, which appeared in the paper's headlines the following day with the caption, "The Kufstein Zoo's leopards pay respect to the Kaiser and his family." After enjoying the leopards, Berenger and his family moved on to the next exhibit, which featured big cats. Lions, tigers, cougars, and even jaguars from the Amazon were all on display. Perhaps the most exciting exhibit was the rare white tiger, which had been purchased as a cub from an Indian trapper for a substantial price. All of Berenger's children enjoyed the sight of the mighty beasts. However, after seeing the cats, Berenger led them to another area of the park, which was reserved for canines. In this area, there was a wolf exhibit where Hans gazed in awe at his former pet. Linda had never been happy about her little boy having such a dangerous beast as his personal minion. Unlike Genseric, this was no deity's familiar. It was a wild, vicious beast that the boy had raised from a pup. Still, a tamed wolf had the ability to bite the hand that fed it. In the end, after Hans left for college, Linda forced young Wolfgar into the zoo, where he became the alpha of a pack of wolves. Despite being an ordinary wolf, Hans could immediately tell that the alpha of the pack was his. Thus, he walked over to the edge of the railing, and a similar scene unfolded. Wolfgar rushed towards the fencing, nuzzling his head against the cage. Hans's expression turned solemn as he petted the beast's ears with a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Good boy." Though Hans knew the pup was better off in the zoo with a pack of its own, he still felt sad knowing he could no longer look after it. Despite this, he held no ill will towards his mother for sending such a dangerous beast away. At the very least, the creature could live a long and fulfilling life in captivity. However, there were still tears forming in the boy's eyes. Just as these tears were about to fall from his cheeks, his father placed a hand on his shoulder and offered some comforting words. "Wolves are not solitary creatures. Though you raised him since he was a pup, there was no chance of him truly being happy while confined in the palace. Here, he has a family,
and the zoo's caretakers meet all of his needs. It is a better life than releasing him back into the wild. Your mother did what was best for the family. A wolf is not an appropriate house pet, especially with infants around. I only let you raise the beast so that you could learn some discipline. Hans silently nodded and choked back the tears in his eyes. He had long since heard his father's speech about being a man and not crying in front of others. He was not a little kid anymore and knew this was not an appropriate place to lose control of his emotions. His response to his father was far too mature for a boy his age. It's good that he's happy, and that's all that really matters. While Hans was having a moment with his former pet, the rest of the family gazed upon the plaque describing the history of these wolves. On the information board was a photo of the young Prince Hans hugging Wolfgar, both with wide smiles on their faces. The passage explained how the alpha of this pack was raised by the German prince since it was a mere pup and was donated to the zoo when Hans went off to college. After a few moments of silence, Berenger patted Hans on the head and gave him a comforting smile. Come, let's go find something to eat. You'd be surprised how good the food is here. Hans looked at Wolfgar one last time before nodding silently and departing from the area with his family. The beast continued to gaze upon its former master until he was no longer in sight. Only after Hans was gone did it turn its attention back to its family. Berenger and his family approached one of the several restaurants within the Kufstein Zoo. The zoo had many exhibits, habitats, and sections. If it were to exist in Berenger's past life, one might compare it to the Disney World of zoos. It was so large that it was technically created outside the city limits in a special zone of its own. Because of this, there were not only multiple restaurants but also food stalls, merchandise stores, and even animal-themed roller coasters and water slides for families to enjoy when they weren't looking at animals. Naturally, Berenger found an appropriate place for his family to eat at, a local burger joint that was grossly overpriced, as was common in theme parks and zoos in this world and his previous one. Despite this, he had to admit that they made excellent burgers. As a result, he and his family sat down in an outdoor dining area after he ordered for them. After a lengthy order that cost hundreds of marks, Berenger returned to his family with several trays of food and beverages. Upon placing the trays on the table and distributing the food, Berenger sat down between Adela and Henrietta. Just as he was about to take a bite of his burger, 3 of his daughters bolted towards his lap in a fierce competition to see who could get their father's attention first. In the end, Catherine emerged as the winner. She was a year or two older than Zara and Helena, giving her a speed advantage. After sitting on her father's lap, Catherine smiled and struck a victorious pose. Berenger stared in silence at his daughters, 2 of whom were now pouting and expressing their discontent. No fair. Catherine, you're too old to sit in Daddy's lap. In reality, Catherine was about 9 years old, and she felt she was well within her rights to sit in her father's lap. Berenger merely shook his head and ignored the 3 girls and their petty competition. A moment later, Catherine raised one of her steak fries, dipped it in ketchup, and thrust it toward her father. Daddy, say ah. The girl was treating him like a child, which Berenger found rather amusing. Her mother, Adela, pulled out a camera and captured Berenger's uncomfortable expression for posterity. In the end, Berenger decided to play along and snatched the fry with his teeth before swallowing it. The moment he did, Catherine clapped excitedly and dug into her own food. Upon closer inspection, Berenger realized that it wasn't just Zara and Helena who were pouting in envy. All of his women were gazing at him with jealous looks. Realizing this, he quickly defended his actions. What are you looking at? Can't a father show his affection for his daughter? Eat your damn food. As soon as he said these words, Catherine looked up at her father with her deep blue eyes and scolded him for his language. Daddy has to put a gulden in the swear jar. Indeed, Berenger's family was so wealthy that they used guldens in their swear jar. In fact, Berenger was so casual with his profanity around his family that he practically filled the jar every month. The value of a full jar was on par with a standard single-family home in the city of Kufstein. The man gritted his teeth at the news but then calmly accepted his fate. Fine. I will do it when we get home. As for the swear jar, Berenger would distribute its contents equally among his children as part of their monthly allowance.
This illustrated just how much of a problem Berenger had with vulgarity. The idea for the jar actually came from Adela.
In truth, Berenger did not really care about the money he put in the jar, it was a trivial amount to him. What he despised was being punished by his wives, the Kaiser of Germany, for speaking casually around his own children. However, as every man knew, there were some battles in marriage that you just had to accept defeat in. The swear jar was one of these. After sharing a meal with his family, the group packed up their refuse and tossed it in the recycling bin before heading out to see more animals. Their next stop after the canine and feline sections was the primate area. There, the Kaiser's children gazed upon the great apes, monkeys, and other primates with excitement in their eyes. When they reached the bonobos' habitat, Berenger had to move his family through quickly as the creatures were mating, and he didn't want his children to witness such a display. Having finished the primate section, Berenger led his family through other areas, such as the African safari and the Congo jungle, where they rode on trains and river boats through areas filled with various wild animals. In one area, they even spotted the legendary dodo bird, which had yet to go extinct in this age. There were all kinds of sights to enjoy, and it wasn't just land-based life forms. There was even a section for aquatic life, such as manatees, sharks, dolphins, alligators, crocodiles, and caimans, among other species. Ultimately, after nearly 6 hours of enjoying themselves at the zoo, Berenger and his family had not even explored half of the habitats. However, as the sun began to set, a voice erupted over the PA system, alerting all visitors that the zoo would be closing in an hour. As a result, Berenger instructed his family that it was time to depart. Well, let's make our way back to the parking lot where the car awaits us. The zoo will be closing soon, and we don't have enough time to look at another exhibit. Voices of protest immediately erupted as several of Berenger's children refused to leave, even after 6 hours of walking about. I don't wanna. But we haven't even looked at the elephants. I don't care about the elephants, I want to see the leopards again. Berenger could only gaze sternly and give his children a direct order. At a time like this, there was no point in playing along with their delusions. They were on the other end of the park and had an hour to exit the facility. Thus, he had no patience for their childish resistance. We're leaving, and that's final. If you all behave, I'll bring you back here next month so that we can see the rest of the park. This time, none of Berenger's children complained, though they were regretful that they couldn't experience everything the zoo had to offer. They were happy that they would get to have such a fun experience with their father again next month. Still, it seemed like too much time between visits, but all the kids knew their father was a busy man who couldn't take entire days off to spend at the zoo very often. With that said, Berenger and his family made their way out of the zoo and entered a group of stretch limousines, which carried their large party back to the palace. There, the Kaiser spent the rest of the evening with his family. After a long day, he retired to his bedroom, where all 5 of his women were waiting. For the first time in a long time, he would share his bed with all of his legal wives and his younger sister. Shuji sat atop his carriage with a proud smile on his face as he strode through the streets of the southern capital of Indochina, a victorious conqueror. For the past few months, the Ming dynasty had been waging war in the region to bring it under the tributary system. Previously, only the northern half of the region paid tribute to the Ming emperor. However, with the fall of Panduranga, the south had officially entered the Chinese sphere of influence. The Ming prince was visibly ecstatic as he waved to the onlookers with a friendly smile. Though he had come as a conqueror, he had no intention of punishing the defeated for their resistance. After all, he was not a petty man and understood that the Indochinese had fought for their sovereignty, a cause that Zhu respected. As the Ming prince strolled through the southern capital, a beautiful young Vietnamese woman tossed flowers toward him. This immediately caught the prince's eye, and he blew a kiss to the woman, causing her to blush in embarrassment. Despite his flamboyant nature, Zhu had no real interest in taking the woman as a concubine. It was only after the troops stopped outside the Indochinese king's palace that the Ming prince stepped down from his carriage and approached the man who had submitted after months of brutal warfare. An interpreter translated Zhu words as he greeted the defeated king with respect. Tao Kai Tom, your people have fought well, but in the end, it was a foolish endeavor to resist our kind offer. I hope that after your defeat, you have learned to be more humble toward my father, Zhu said. The once proud king of South Indochina bowed his head respectfully.
Though he gritted his teeth in frustration over his defeat, he did not dare voice his discontent. Instead, he forced a pleasant smile to appear on his face as he greeted the Ming prince as his conqueror. "Prince Shuji, I have heard rumors of your legendary experience as a battlefield commander. It was my foolishness to believe that I could ever resist a brilliant general such as yourself." Though Kaitam spoke these words, he knew in his heart that the only reason the Ming had so easily defeated his resistance was because of their advanced weapons. Nonetheless, his defeat was certain, and if he could retain his title as king, he would gladly kneel before the Ming crown. However, Zhu Ji's light-hearted response startled him. "I believe I warned you before my invasion that it was in your best interest to submit to my father. However, you stubbornly refused my advice and caused this unnecessary suffering. Still, I respect your spirit, which is why I am speaking to you here in front of your palace, rather than having you bound in chains. I want to make this clear to you and all your people: we are not your enemies. We came into your lands as your protectors. If the Japanese had invaded your country as they have done to the Joseon, the Ryukyu, the Ainu, and most recently the island of Mindanao, believe me when I say that you and your people would not have been treated with such kindness after your defeat." The Indo-Chinese king was startled to hear this news. Though he had heard rumors of Japanese expansion, he had never thought his land would be the target of their greed. However, from what Jushi told him, it seemed the Ming invasion of his lands was a countermeasure to the rapid expansion of the Japanese Empire. If that were the case, the Ming dynasty must have some proof that Empress Itami eyed these lands with avarice in her heart. As a result, he could not help but ask for this evidence, even if it could be seen as inappropriate on his part. "You must have some evidence to support the claim that the Japanese intend to invade my lands. Just because they are invading their neighbors does not mean they have any intent to annex my lands." Though Kaitam's tone was overbearing, Jushi did not take offense. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out several photos taken by agents of the German Empire. They were of bauxite deposits located within southern Indochina. After handing the photographs to the Indochinese king, Jushi wore a smug smile as he responded. "These are images taken by our friends in the German Empire. In case you don't recognize this resource, it is plentiful within your borders. The Japanese Empire will soon be looking for an alternative source of this mineral. While Empress Itami does not realize it yet, the Germans will soon defeat her proxies in India. When this happens, she will need to search elsewhere for this mineral, which is critical to her plans for industrial expansion. If you were to remain independent, she would surely strike at your lands and enslave your people to mine this resource, as she has done in the southern half of the Joseon Peninsula. By subjecting you to our tributary system, we have given you a shield, which will force the Japanese Empire to decide between attacking the Ming dynasty or the Majapahit Empire. Based on our calculations, it would be much easier for her to take Borneo and transport this mineral back to her homeland than to secure it from a Ming-controlled Indochina. Thus, by subjecting your petty kingdom, we have spared you a great deal of suffering, more than you have already endured during our brief campaign." Although Zhu Ji's words were convincing, Kaitam did not understand what bauxite was or what possible use it had. Therefore, he had a hard time believing that the Japanese Empire would invade his lands for such an obscure resource. If the Ming prince was being honest, he himself doubted whether these claims were true. However, they were spoken by the Kaiser, and if anyone knew what the Japanese were up to, it would be the Germans. Despite Zhu Ji's unwavering belief in Berenger's words, Kaitam was far from convinced and quickly voiced his doubt. "What evidence do you have that the Japanese would invade my lands for this mineral?" If Zhu Ji were a less intelligent man, this question would have stumped him for sure. Unlike his now deceased little brother, he had a sharp mind and a quick wit. Thus, he did not even need to think of a satisfactory answer as he spoke. "Only the word of the Germans, but if anyone knows what Empress Itami is planning, it would be them. After all, the Germans have long infiltrated the Japanese mainland, so much so that they were able to get their hands on many secret weapons designs. In fact, the Kaiser recently gifted my father a rather large warship that is a complete replica of what Empress Itami is currently constructing for her fleets." To the Indo-Chinese king, this news was utterly shocking. While German merchants had long since made their way to his lands, bringing with them many items that could only be acquired through trade with the Reich, he had never expected the Germans to infiltrate the Japanese mainland to such an extent that they could recreate Japanese warships. After all,
the Indochinese king had seen the German and Japanese fleets pass by his territorial waters and was deeply frightened by what he witnessed. He honestly did not know which of the two great powers would emerge victorious if they ever came to blows. Neither Zhu Ji nor Kai Tam were aware that Germany had only recently infiltrated the Japanese mainland within the last year and had been extremely cautious in their clandestine operations. Instead, the replication of the Japanese cruiser was achieved by taking in Japanese refugees who had worked on the project before their defection. Despite this ignorance, it was this misconception that thoroughly convinced the Indochinese king to fully lay down any resistance he might still have harbored in his heart and accept the Ming dynasty as his new overlords. If this was an era of great empires that controlled large swaths of the earth, then he would rather be swallowed up by the Ming than the Japanese or Germans. At least his people had a long history of contact with the Chinese. Thus, just like this, the last resistance in Indochina came to an end, and the Ming successfully subjected the entire region as a tributary state to their mighty empire. In doing so, they had played right into the hands of Berenger, whose goal was to deny the Japanese empire a valuable source of bauxite. Throughout the past decade, crop yields in Austria and later in the German Empire had risen to an unimaginable degree. So much so that there was no such thing as a hungry German family, whether they lived in the fatherland or in the many colonies that had sprung up across the globe. With an extensive welfare state that prioritized reintroducing workers into employment and a robust economy founded on the gold standard, the people within the Reich had almost completely eradicated homelessness and starvation from their society. There was such a food surplus that Germany was now giving out massive food aid to its tributary states, which were suffering from a lack of young men to work in the fields. This was, of course, the result of their own folly, having forced a war with the Reich that saw 1 million men from across Europe perish. However, as advanced as German agriculture might be, it still did not measure up to the world Berenger came from, for one very specific reason: they had yet to invent modern synthetic fertilizer. Why was this the case? Until recently, Berenger did not feel that it was a crucial aspect of his technological development. After all, they already had a massive food surplus. However, with the rapid increase in the German population over the past decade and the continued population growth projected, there was an ever-increasing demand for food. Meanwhile, the colonies in Lindenheim and Adelheim were not expanding fast enough to keep up with the baby boom. As a result, the Kaiser had tasked a small team of chemists with solving the synthetic fertilizer problem. Miraculously, they needed about 3 months to complete a finished product and another 3 months to show the results, which Aldo von Passau was quick to introduce to Berenger. The two men were currently standing in one of the many chemical laboratories that existed across the Reich. The synthetic compound was demonstrated in its use for growing potatoes. Standing before Berenger was a small plot of land divided in half. One half used the new synthetic fertilizer, while the other used the traditional fertilizer, which included slag from Bessemer converters to increase phosphate content. Aldo had a proud look on his face as he demonstrated the massive difference in crop yields between the two. The plot with the synthetic fertilizer produced nearly 5 times as many potatoes as the plot with the traditional fertilizer. With a haughty tone, the aging chemist informed the Kaiser of his discoveries. "As always, your preliminary instructions were right on the money, Your Highness. After a brief amount of experimentation, we were able to create a synthetic fertilizer rich in potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus, all of which greatly aid plant growth. For the nitrogen, we used ammonia, synthesized from natural gas and air. The phosphorus came from a combination of sulfur, coal, and phosphate rock. The potassium content was derived from potassium chloride. We also added secondary nutrients such as calcium and magnesium. The calcium was obtained from limestone, which contains calcium carbonate, calcium sulfate, and calcium magnesium carbonate. The magnesium was derived from dolomite. Additional nutrients included sulfur, copper, molybdenum from molybdenum oxide, and iron from ferrous sulfate. It's all quite technical, but the end result is this amazing new fertilizer, which we can produce in vast quantities and which achieves a growth rate in potatoes nearly 5 times our current crop yields. As you know, the potato has become the staple of our diet, and because of this, our population has grown not only in numbers but in stature as well. I can't believe that the youth of today is already, on average, tens of centimeters taller than those born in my day. It is truly a miracle what you have accomplished in just 13 short years. Berenger was genuinely astonished at how quickly his chemists came up with a solution to this problem. However, upon reflection, it was an obvious conclusion. These individuals were introduced to an undergraduate understanding of science 13 years ago and had advanced the field on their own to the point where they could now manufacture vaccines for serious illnesses. His number of chemists also grew each year, as more and more young men and women graduated from university with majors in the field, expanding his ever-growing network of scientists and engineers. Thus, something as simple as modern fertilizer, when compared to the achievements of scientists who had only recently begun to understand the principles of nuclear physics, was a relatively minor accomplishment. It was no exaggeration to say that by providing a basic foundation in all modern sciences to his population, as well as emphasizing education, knowledge sharing, and hard work, Berenger might very well leave behind a civilization that was on par with or greater than those that existed in his past life. Either way, Berenger was proud of his chemist's achievements and was quick to hand out the due rewards with a wide grin on his face. And here I thought I would have to worry about rationing food in 20 years. Aldo, when you get the chance, send me a list of the names of the men and women who worked on this project. I'll reward them each with an imperial order of science and art. A wide smile formed on Aldo's lips as he heard these words. It appeared that each passing year brought more and more scientists and artists this prestigious award. Berenger knew that only a handful of men and women worked on this project, and thus he was willing to award what was essentially the Nobel Prize to these talented chemists. After all, though the introduction of modern synthetic fertilizers might not seem significant to the ignorant, it would allow the right to feed the exponential growth of future generations without ever having to worry about running out of food. Especially since Berenger's Germany had a culture of not wasting food. With that said, Aldo was swift in his response, though, as always, his performance was over the top. He took a deep bow and placed a hand on his heart, swearing an oath that was utterly meaningless. Your Magnificence, I swear on my life, I will have this list of names on your desk before the workday ends. Berenger could only sigh and smile in response. He had known Aldo long enough to no longer get irritated by the man's remarkable ability to kiss ass. As a result, he nodded his head silently in acceptance before declaring his departure. Well, if that is all, Aldo, then I will let you and your talented team get back to what you do best. I look forward to seeing the crop yields next year. After saying this, Berenger returned to his palace with a pep in his step. His society would not only be able to produce large quantities of food, but unlike the United States of America of his past life, there would be strict laws in place to ensure that all food was of the highest quality. For example, all animals would be free-range and fed natural diets. To Berenger, the health of his people was more important than the quantity of food. Thus, everything in German society, even desserts such as pastries and cookies, would be produced with the healthiest and most natural ingredients. There would be no high-fructose corn syrup, trans fats, or corn-fed beef, as was once prevalent in the American diet of his past life. In fact, the moment he got home, Berenger decided to contact the Loyalist Party and have them draft a bill that prioritized food health and safety over quantity, ensuring future generations had the benefit of healthy meals and were not fed junk food. With the introduction of synthetic fertilizers, a law that required corporations to use mostly natural products, and an education system with a strong focus on hard work and physical fitness, Berenger could rest easy knowing the future German population would have a hard time degenerating into a nation of lazy, unhealthy individuals. News of the Ming dynasty's annexation of all of Indochina quickly reached the ears of both the Japanese Empress and the German Kaiser. At the moment, Nakamura Hana, the head of the Kempeitai, was informing Itami Ryo of what had recently occurred in the southeast. According to our intelligence, it appears that the crown prince of the Ming dynasty has led a brief campaign through the jungles of southern Indochina, successfully subjecting them to the tributary system. Why the Ming dynasty has suddenly decided to aggressively expand its sphere of influence is uncertain. However, it seems that the German arms they have purchased have played a significant role in their swift victory. Itami portrayed herself as calm and collected, but in reality, she was slightly perturbed. For some time, she had known that the Ming dynasty was being supplied with weapons from the German Empire. However, the amount of money Germany was making by selling arms to the Ming was undoubtedly significant. While the Ming dynasty was the Japanese Empire's largest trading partner, the goods exchanged were largely luxury items. Not once had the Ming Emperor requested the sale of arms.
It felt almost as if he was spitting in her face by doing so. Thus, Itami could not help but suspect that Zhu Wuti was secretly violating his neutral stance by supporting the German Empire. Of course, she had no way to prove this and could only vent her frustration on the Ming prince. At the very least, this Zhu Ji is more capable than his foolish younger brother. I wonder why that old dog Zhu Wuti did not send this child as his ambassador to my empire. Is he perhaps looking down on me? Nakamura had no answer to this question and instead looked away, unwilling to meet the fury in the Empress's crimson eyes. After several moments of contemplation, Itami gave a simple order before changing the subject. Keep an eye on Ming activities within the southeast. If they begin expanding further, I want to know about it. Besides that, update me on the status of the German warships in the Indian Ocean. Weren't they previously spotted by our fleets sailing westward? Upon hearing her Empress's question, the intelligence director quickly flipped through her notes before stumbling upon the most recent news of the German fleet. Yes, here it is. A small fleet, composed of what appears to be a corvette and a few destroyers, sailed to the southwest before going beyond our range of detection. I don't know precisely where they were headed, but they have recently reappeared east of the Majapahit Empire. A frown formed on Itami's luscious lips. She could guess where this fleet was headed, though why it had done so was up to interpretation. It could not feasibly be that the Germans had begun to explore Australasia with the intent of colonizing the region, could it? Upon considering this possibility, Itami's eyes darted toward Nakamura before giving her a direct order. Relay my commands to the appropriate branches. I want an expeditionary fleet assembled and sent southwest in the direction the German fleet was headed. If you find any presence of the Germans in the region, report it back to me immediately. Nakamura had no way of knowing why the Empress was so concerned about such a small fleet. But she did not refuse the order and instead bowed her head humbly in response. Yes, Tenno Haika-sama. Itami barely noticed the woman's response and was instead in deep thought. Australasia, as a whole, was filled with many natural resources, especially Australia itself. If the Germans colonized the region before she did, they would not only gain an additional industrial advantage. They would also have the ability to flank her forces with military bases in Singapore and Australia. Such a scenario was a nightmare for her future war efforts. It was only after several moments of silence that Itami realized Nakamura was still present, and she quickly dismissed the woman with a rather irritated tone in her voice. Well, what are you waiting for? This shrill remark nearly made the director of intelligence jump out of her skin, and she quickly bowed her head once more before scurrying off like a scared cat. Once she was gone, Itami gazed intensely at the portrait of Berenger, questioning what the man was thinking. Just what are you up to? Naturally, there was no response, but Itami felt as if she was peering into the eyes of a very mysterious man, one who had repeatedly outmaneuvered her. As a result, she could only frown and curse at the painting. Fucking bastard. Berenger felt the need to sneeze, as if someone was speaking ill of him. Despite this sudden urge, he mustered his will and prevented himself from doing so. After all, he was in an important meeting with a man he had not seen in years. In the colony of Barenstadt, Berenger sat in a lovely villa that served as his personal abode during his visits to the region. The colony of Barenstadt, like most German colonies, had developed rapidly into a sprawling city with technology similar to that of the fatherland. The thousands of Dominion II-class cargo ships constructed over the years and operated by German merchants ensured a constant flow of goods between the German colonies and the fatherland, allowing the colonies to develop at a rate similar to the fatherland. In this city, electricity was a common sight, as were indoor plumbing and running water. Waste treatment facilities and recycling plants also existed. In the nearby farmlands, combined harvesters and tractors, powered by hemp-based biodiesel, did all the work. In other words, the colonies of the German Empire, or at least those established years ago, had living conditions similar to those in the fatherland. Meanwhile, the neighboring Aztec Empire was in a similar state to its previous iteration, with the primary difference being the use of steel tools purchased by the Reich and an increase in agricultural output. In fact, the rapid progress in the colony of Barenstadt astonished Emperor Itzcoatl. If this city was even a fraction of the glory found in what the Germans called the fatherland, then they were indeed no different from living gods.
Ultimately, Berengar had to snap the Aztec emperor out of his daze, speaking to him in a courteous tone. "So, I heard that you successfully conquered the neighboring Mayan Empire. Is that correct?" Itzcoatl immediately snapped to attention, nodding his head in silence 3 times. Seeing this, Berengar smiled and proposed an opportunity to the Aztec emperor. "Good. I have plans for the southernmost regions of the territory that previously belonged to the Mayans. I intend to invest a substantial amount of time, effort, and resources into building a great canal to allow my ships direct access to the Pacific Ocean. To do this in the most timely manner, I will need the support of your empire, specifically the vast network of slaves at your disposal. Can you fulfill my requirements?" Though the Aztec Empire was technically a tributary state, its existence relied heavily on the protection and trade provided by the Germans. Itzcoatl was willing to do whatever Berengar asked of him. Thus, he nodded his head with a submissive smile as he responded to Berengar's request. "That won't be a problem. We captured far too many slaves from the Mayans. Now that we no longer sacrifice people, we have more slaves than we know what to do with. How many do you need?" A sadistic grin curved on Berengar's face as he considered this particular issue. While he had outlawed slavery, he was not so delusional that he was unaware of its practicality. In fact, slavery had been an efficient means of labor used throughout human history to accomplish grand feats. The reason Berengar had outlawed slavery was not because he found the practice morally abhorrent. In this world, it was still a common practice outside the Reich, and he had done nothing to stop it, as he did not see it as his personal responsibility. No, Berengar outlawed slavery and inflicted severe punishments on citizens caught engaging in such crimes to avoid the disastrous consequences that Western civilizations had faced after the Atlantic slave trade ended in his past life. The last thing he needed was for future generations of Germans to become spineless, self-loathing cowards who spat at their own civilization's history simply because it had once committed an act that was normal throughout human existence. Nor did he desire the existence of a substantial ethnic minority demanding reparations for past deeds while blaming all their community's problems on this historical practice. If there was anything the failures of the United States of America had taught Berengar, it was to avoid a multi-ethnic and multicultural nation at all costs. Thus, the importation and trade of slaves was strictly outlawed, specifically to avoid the civil strife caused by such a failed society. As a result, Berengar had no qualms about using slave labor from the Aztec Empire to build the Panama Canal as quickly as possible. Since it was in a foreign land, with a foreign populace, he responded with the number he desired. At the bare minimum, 10,000. I can import workers from the fatherland and the equipment needed to build the canal. However, the project would progress much faster with the aid of slave labor. If you can promise me 10,000 slaves, I will be able to complete this effort in less than 5 years. Itzcoatl chuckled upon hearing such a paltry sum and immediately began to boast of his abilities. If there was one metric the Aztec Empire surpassed the Reich in, it was the number of slaves they had access to, something he, as an Aztec, took great pride in. 10,000? I can double that, and still have tens of thousands of slaves to spare in my markets. Why don't we just call it 50,000? And you can do what you want with them after you have finished your work. This number surprised even Berengar, but ultimately he nodded in response. If he had 5 times the number of slaves, he could finish the project 5 times as quickly. Perhaps all he needed was a year to complete the Panama Canal. Thus, he smiled and nodded silently, condemning 50,000 slaves to a year of brutal labor.